Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The call came through dispatch at 4:47 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon in late November, just as the Alaskan darkness was beginning its early descent over the Matanuska-Susitna Valley. State Trooper Cornelius Blackwood had been patrolling the park's highway near Willow when the crackling voice of dispatcher Meredith cut through the static that plagued communications in the remote regions north of Anchorage. Unit 7. We've got a welfare check request out at mile marker 82, Hatcher Pass Road. Concerned neighbor hasn't seen Ezra Whitfield or his wife Prudence in over 2 weeks. Says their generator's been running non-stop, but no one's answering the door. Cornelius acknowledged the call, already mentally calculating the drive time to the remote cabin. Hatcher Pass Road in late November was treacherous under the best circumstances. A winding mountain route that climbed through dense spruce forests and alpine terrain where cell towers were non-existent and help, if needed, could be hours away. The welfare check request had come from Silas Brennan, who lived in a cabin approximately 2 miles from the Whitfields. In the sparse communities scattered throughout Alaska's wilderness, neighbors looked out for each other despite the distances between properties. 2 weeks of silence combined with a continuously running generator suggested something was seriously wrong. Cornelius had been an Alaska State Trooper for 12 years, spending most of that time working the vast territory north of Anchorage. He'd responded to enough welfare checks to know they usually ended one of 3 ways. The residents were fine, but had simply been keeping to themselves. They'd left for an unexpected trip without telling anyone. Or they were dead. In winter, with elderly residents like the Whitfields, the third option was unfortunately common. The drive to Hatcher Pass Road took 45 minutes through increasingly heavy snowfall. The temperature had dropped to minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that exposed skin would begin to freeze within minutes. As he turned onto the narrow access road leading to the Whitfield property, Cornelius noticed fresh tire tracks in the snow, partially filled but visible. Someone had driven this way within the last day or two. The tracks were unusual, not the single set you'd expect from the Whitfield's old pickup, but multiple vehicles. At least 3 different sets of tire tracks, including what looked like a larger vehicle, maybe a van or SUV. Cornelius made a mental note. The Whitfields rarely had visitors, especially not multiple vehicles worth. The cabin came into view through the swirling snow, a modest log structure with smoke rising from the chimney. But something felt wrong immediately. The windows were dark despite the early evening hour. No lights at all, even though the generator Silas had mentioned was indeed running, its steady drone audible even over Cornelius's engine. He parked 20 yards from the cabin and radioed dispatch, though the transmission was broken by static. The mountains interfered with radio signals, meaning he might be out of communication for extended periods. Standard procedure for welfare checks in remote locations. Approach carefully, announce yourself, but be prepared for anything. The first thing Cornelius noticed when he stepped out of his vehicle was the smell. Even in the cold, which typically suppressed odors, there was a distinct scent of decay in the air. His hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon, though he didn't draw it. The smell of death was familiar to any trooper who'd worked remote Alaska. Sometimes you found people who'd been dead for weeks before anyone noticed. But as he approached the cabin, he saw something that made him stop. The snow around the entrance had been disturbed recently, multiple sets of footprints going in and out. fresh prints, maybe a few hours old at most. Someone had been here very recently, yet hadn't reported anything to authorities. Cornelius knocked on the door, announcing himself clearly. "Alaska State Troopers. Ezra, Prudence, this is Trooper Blackwood. Silas Brennan asked me to check on you folks." No response. He knocked again, harder. The door shifted slightly. It wasn't latched properly. That was unusual. In bear country, even in winter, people kept doors secured. "I'm coming in to check on your welfare," Cornelius announced, pushing the door open. The smell hit him like a physical force. Death, certainly, but more than that. The sweet, sick smell of decomposition mixed with something else. Wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and what might have been rotting food. Cornelius drew his weapon and flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark interior. The main room was in chaos. Furniture overturned, papers scattered everywhere, dark stains on the wooden floor that looked like dried blood, but no bodies. Cornelius moved carefully through the cabin, checking each room while calling out, though he expected no response. In the bedroom, he found them. Ezra and Prudence Whitfield were both dead, had been for at least a week based on the decomposition. They were in their bed, but this hadn't been a peaceful death. Both showed signs of trauma, bruising on their necks, defensive wounds on their arms. They'd been murdered. But that wasn't the worst part. Someone had been living in the cabin with their bodies. Recently. There were fresh food wrappers, empty bottles, cigarette butts that couldn't have been more than a day or two old. Someone had killed the elderly couple and then stayed in their home, living alongside their corpses. Cornelius backed out of the room, his weapon raised, suddenly aware that whoever had done this might still be in the cabin. He needed to clear the rest of the structure and call for backup immediately. But as he turned toward the door, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Footsteps on the porch outside. Multiple sets. They were back. Cornelius moved to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. 3 men were approaching the cabin, all wearing heavy winter gear that obscured their features. They moved casually, like they belonged here. One was carrying what looked like supplies from a vehicle parked just out of sight. These weren't random intruders. They'd been using the cabin as some kind of base, probably since they'd killed the Whitfields. Drug dealers using the remote location to cook meth, fugitives hiding from law enforcement. Whatever they were about to walk into a cabin with an armed state trooper. Cornelius quickly assessed his options. He was outnumbered 3-1, in a remote location with no backup available for at least an hour. The radio was barely functional. He could try to arrest them, but that would likely end in a shootout. He could hide and wait for them to leave, but they might discover his vehicle. Or he could use the element of surprise. The front door opened, and the first man entered, not bothering to knock or announce himself. He was younger than Cornelius had expected, maybe mid-20s with a scruffy beard and eyes that darted nervously around the room. He froze when he saw Cornelius standing there with his weapon drawn. "State Police. Hands where I can see them. Now." The man's hand shot up, but his eyes went to the door, calculating. "Hey, easy there, officer. We're friends of the Whitfields. They said we could crash here. The Whitfields are dead. Have been for over a week. You want to try again?" The man's expression changed, the pretense dropping away. "Look, this isn't what you think." The other 2 men appeared in the doorway. Unlike their companion, they didn't hesitate. One immediately reached for what Cornelius recognized as a weapon in his waistband. Training took over. Cornelius shifted his aim and fired twice. Center mass. The man went down. The second man dove to the side, out of the doorway, while the first man lunged at Cornelius, trying to grab his weapon. They struggled, crashing into furniture, the gun firing once into the ceiling before Cornelius managed to strike the man with his elbow, stunning him. But the third man was still outside, armed, and now knew exactly where Cornelius was. The trooper grabbed the stunned man and pushed him toward the door as a shield just as gunfire erupted from outside. Bullets splintered the door frame. Cornelius fired back through the doorway, not aiming to hit but to suppress, buying himself time to think. He was pinned down in a cabin with 2 dead elderly people, 1 dead suspect, 1 stunned suspect, and at least 1 armed hostile outside. The situation had gone from bad to catastrophic in seconds. The stunned man tried to crawl away, but Cornelius grabbed him, pressing his weapon to the man's head. "Tell your friend to stand down, or you're next." "Tommy!" the man yelled. "Tommy, stop shooting! He's got me!" The gunfire stopped. A voice called from outside. "You okay in there, Jake?" "Tell him to throw his weapon away and come out with his hands up," Cornelius instructed. Jake hesitated, and Cornelius pressed the gun harder against his head. "Do it." "Tommy," he says, "throw your gun away and come out." There was a long pause. Then Tommy's voice, closer now, maybe just outside the door. "How about we make a deal, trooper? You let Jake go and we all walk away. Nobody else has to die today." "No deals. You're under arrest for murder." Tommy laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Murder? We didn't kill those old folks. They were dead when we got here 5 days ago. We just needed a place to lay low." "From what? Does it matter? Look, we've got a problem here. You can't call for backup. Radios don't work up here. Your vehicle's outside, but you can't get to it without going through me. And I'm not going to prison. So either we figure something out, or this ends badly for everyone." Cornelius knew Tommy was right about the tactical situation, but he also knew something Tommy didn't. He'd triggered his emergency beacon when he'd first entered the cabin. Help was coming, but it would take time. "How about this?" Cornelius said. "You tell me who really killed the Whitfields, and maybe we can work something out." There was another pause. Then Tommy said something that chilled Cornelius more than the Arctic wind outside. "You really want to know?" It was Silas. Silas Brennan, the neighbor who called in the welfare check. The pieces suddenly clicked into place in Cornelius's mind. Silas calling in the welfare check, knowing what would be found. The fresh tire tracks. Some of them would match Silas's truck. He'd killed his neighbors, and then used these men's presence as cover, knowing they'd be blamed. "You're saying Silas Brennan killed them? Why?" "Land dispute," Jake said from the floor. "The old man told us about it when we first got here, before we found the bodies. The Whitfields owned water rights that Silas wanted. They wouldn't sell, so he resolved the dispute his way. We showed up looking for a place to hide out, found them dead, figured we could use the cabin for a few days. We were going to leave tonight." "What are you hiding from?" "Does it matter? We didn't kill anyone here." Cornelius processed this information quickly. 3 criminals who'd been squatting in a murder scene, but possibly not the actual killers. And Silas Brennan, the helpful neighbor, potentially the real murderer. But he still had an immediate problem, getting out of this situation alive. "Here's what's going to happen," Cornelius said. "You're going to—" He was interrupted by the sound of another vehicle approaching. Everyone froze. Through the window, Cornelius could see headlights cutting through the snow. A pickup truck. As it got closer, he recognized it. Silas Brennan. The truck stopped, and Silas got out carrying a shotgun. He saw Cornelius's patrol vehicle and stopped, assessing the situation. Then he called out, "Trooper Blackwood?" Everything all right in there? I saw your vehicle and thought you might need help." Tommy laughed bitterly from outside. "Oh, this is perfect." The real killer shows up to play hero. Silas heard him, and his demeanor changed instantly. The friendly concern vanished, replaced by cold calculation. He raised the shotgun. "Sounds like you've got a situation, trooper. These the men who killed my neighbors?" "Silas," Cornelius called out. "I need you to put the weapon down and step back." "Can't do that, trooper. These men are dangerous. They killed Ezra and Prudence. I'm not letting them get away with it." "We didn't kill anyone, you lying bastard," Tommy yelled. "You did it. We know you did." Silas fired the shotgun, the blast hitting the cabin wall near where Tommy's voice had come from. "Shut your mouth, boy." Cornelius realized the situation was spiraling completely out of control. He had 3 suspects, one of whom might be the actual killer, all armed, and he was caught in the middle. He made a tactical decision. "Everyone needs to calm down, Silas. These men claim you killed the Whitfields. They say they found them already dead." Silas's voice turned cold. "And you believe them? 3 criminals over a respected member of this community." "I believe evidence, Silas. And right now, I've got questions that need answering." There was a long silence. Then Silas spoke again, his tone different, resigned. 20 years I've lived next to them, 20 years of disputes over that water. They were going to sell to a developer, would have ruined everything up here. I tried to reason with them. "So, you killed them?" "I didn't mean to. Went to talk to them one last time. Things got heated. Ezra took a swing at me with a poker from the fireplace. I defended myself. Prudence. She tried to call for help. I had to stop her. It just happened." "And you left them there?" I panicked. Came back the next day to clean up, but these 3 were already there. I figured, let them take the blame. Who'd believe them over me? So I waited a few days and called in the welfare check. Cornelius felt sick. An elderly couple dead over water rights. 3 criminals framed for a murder they didn't commit. And Silas, the helpful neighbor, orchestrating it all. "Silas, I need you to put down the shotgun and surrender yourself." "Can't do that, trooper. I've got too much to lose. Here's what's going to happen. These 3 men killed the Whitfields, and they killed you when you tried to arrest them. I arrived just in time to stop them, but tragically you were already dead. I'm a hero. They go to prison or die here, and life goes on. That's not happening, Silas. No? You're outnumbered, trooper. And unlike these boys, I know this land. I know where your backup has to come from, and they're not getting here in this storm, not for hours." The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop even further. Cornelius realized he might not survive this, but he had a job to do. "Jake," he said to the man on the floor. "What's your last name?" "Wilson." "Jake Wilson. Jake Wilson. You're under arrest for criminal trespass and tampering with evidence. You have the right to remain silent." Silas fired again, this time through the window. Glass shattered and cold wind howled into the cabin. "Stop talking, trooper. This ends now." What happened next occurred almost too fast to process. Tommy, still outside, used Silas's distraction to move position. He fired at Silas, who dove behind his truck. Jake tried to run, but Cornelius tackled him. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions. When it was over, Tommy was dead, shot by Silas. Silas was wounded, Tommy's bullet having caught him in the shoulder. Jake was unconscious from where Cornelius had been forced to strike him to prevent his escape. And Cornelius was bleeding from where flying glass had cut his face and arms. Silas was trying to reload his shotgun one-handed when Cornelius reached him, kicking the weapon away and forcing him to the ground. The older man didn't resist, his strength fading as blood seeped from his wound. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," Silas mumbled. "They were old. They were going to die soon anyway. The water rights, my family's lived here for 3 generations. I couldn't let developers come in." Cornelius handcuffed him and did what he could to stop the bleeding. Then he secured Jake and checked on the man he'd shot when they'd first entered. Dead. 3 bodies now, in addition to the Whitfields. 5 deaths that had started with a dispute over water. It took 2 hours for backup to arrive, the storm having worsened. By then, Cornelius had processed the scene as best he could, documented everything, and gotten a full confession from Silas, who seemed almost relieved to tell someone what he'd done. Jake Wilson, it turned out, was wanted for robbery in Anchorage, along with his 2 dead companions. They'd been hiding out, looking for an empty cabin to use when they'd stumbled upon the Whitfield's place. Bad luck had put them in the wrong place at the wrong time. Silas was charged with 2 counts of murder and died in prison 3 years later, never showing remorse for killing his neighbors, only regret that he'd been caught. The Whitfield cabin was eventually sold, the new owners unaware of its history. The water rights Silas had killed for ended up going to the state when no heirs could be found. Cornelius received a commendation for his handling of the situation, but the case haunted him. 5 people dead because of water rights and bad timing. The brutality that could exist in the isolation of Alaska's wilderness, where the nearest help was hours away, and disputes could turn deadly with no witnesses. He continued to patrol the same region for another 5 years before transferring to Anchorage. But he never forgot the Whitfield cabin, or the reminder it provided that in Alaska's vast isolation, civilization was always just a thin veneer. Neighbors could become killers. Killers could become victims, and a simple welfare check could spiral into a bloodbath. The most disturbing part was how normal Silas had seemed. A helpful neighbor, concerned about the elderly couple, willing to drive through a storm to check on them. Right up until the moment he'd raised that shotgun, ready to kill everyone to cover up his crime. It was a reminder that in the isolation of Alaska, you never really knew your neighbors. And sometimes the person calling for help was the one you should fear the most. The aftermath of the Whitfield cabin incident required 3 days of investigation and evidence processing. Cornelius remained on scene, working with the forensics team from Anchorage who had finally made it through the storm. Every room told a different part of the story, and the more they uncovered, the more disturbing the full picture became. Jake Wilson, recovering in custody at the hospital, had become surprisingly cooperative once he realized he was facing murder charges. His full account revealed details that made the situation even more complex than initially thought. "We were running from a deal gone bad in Anchorage," Jake explained during his formal interview, his lawyer present but seemingly resigned to the situation. Thomas Brennan, the one Silas shot, he owed money to the wrong people. We figured we'd head north, find somewhere isolated to lay low until things cooled off. The plan was maybe Canada eventually. "How did you find the Whitfield cabin?" Cornelius asked. "Pure accident. We were driving around looking for abandoned summer cabins. You know, the kind rich people from Anchorage build and then barely use. We saw the smoke from the chimney, figured someone was home, almost passed it by, but Tommy wanted to check if maybe they'd rent us a room for cash, no questions asked." Jake's hands shook slightly as he continued. "When we knocked, no answer. Door was unlocked, though. Tommy went in first, and the smell. We knew immediately something was wrong. Found them in the bedroom. They'd been dead for days. And you decided to stay. Tommy's call. He said it was perfect, isolated, already had supplies, and if anyone came looking, they'd find the bodies and assume we did it, so we'd have warning to run. We were only going to stay a couple days, but the storm hit and then, well, you showed up. The forensic evidence supported Jake's timeline. The Whitfields had been dead for approximately 10 days when Cornelius arrived, but Jake and his companions had only been there for 5. The evidence of the actual murder, blood spatter patterns, defensive wounds, the poker Silas had mentioned, all pointed to a struggle that had occurred before the trio arrived. But it was what investigators found in Silas Brennan's cabin that provided the full, disturbing picture. Silas had been planning the murder for months. They found journals dating back 2 years, documenting every perceived slight from the Whitfields, every dispute over the water rights, building to an obsession that consumed him. He'd drawn maps of their property, noted their routines, even researched how long bodies took to decompose in various temperatures. One entry, dated 3 weeks before the murder, was particularly chilling. They refused my final offer today. Ezra laughed at me, said I'd never be able to afford what the developers were offering. Prudence just stood there with that superior smile. They don't understand what this land means. My grandfather homesteaded here. My father died protecting it. I won't let outsiders destroy it for profit. If the Whitfields won't see reason, perhaps they need to be removed from the equation. The water rights issue was more complex than initially understood. A development company from Seattle had been courting the Whitfields, planning to build a small resort that would tap into the natural hot springs on their property. The development would have required access through Silas's land and would have fundamentally changed the character of the isolated valley. Cornelius interviewed other neighbors in the valley, driving to even more remote cabins through roads barely passable after the storm. What emerged was a picture of a community divided. Some, like Silas, saw development as a threat to their way of life. Others saw it as an opportunity for jobs and growth in a region where both were scarce. Martha Henderson, who lived 6 miles from the Whitfields, provided crucial context. Silas changed after his wife died 3 years ago. Patricia was the one who kept him balanced. After she passed, he became obsessed with preserving everything exactly as it was. The water rights thing became his whole focus. He'd corner anyone who'd listen, ranting about developers and outsiders. Did he ever make threats? Cornelius asked. Martha hesitated. Not directly, but he'd say things like, "Someone needs to stop them," or "They'll get what's coming." We all thought he was just talking. You know how people get up here in the winter. Isolation does things to your mind. The investigation also revealed that Silas had been to the Whitfield cabin multiple times after the murder, before Jake and his companions arrived. He'd attempted to stage the scene to look like a murder-suicide, but had done a poor job of it. When the criminals showed up, he saw an opportunity for a better cover story and abandoned his original plan. The physical evidence told the story clearly. Silas had arrived at the Whitfields' cabin on November 14th, ostensibly to make one final offer for the water rights. An argument ensued. Ezra had indeed grabbed a poker from the fireplace, based on the defensive wounds on Silas's arms that were still healing. In the struggle, Silas had taken the poker and struck Ezra multiple times. Prudence had tried to run, knocking over furniture in the main room, but Silas had caught her near the door. The medical examiner's report was clinical, but painted a horrible picture. Ezra had died from blunt force trauma. Prudence had been strangled. Both had fought hard for their lives. During the investigation, something else emerged that made the tragedy even more senseless. The development deal had already fallen through. Unknown to Silas, the developers had pulled out a week before the murders, citing economic concerns. The Whitfields were no longer planning to sell. They had died for nothing. Cornelius found the letter in the Whitfields' mail, still in its envelope. dated 3 days before their deaths. It was from the development company, formally withdrawing their offer. Ezra and Prudence had probably been planning to tell Silas the good news, that his valley would remain unchanged. They never got the chance. The recovery of the bodies was complicated by the weather and the remote location. It took a full day just to get them transported to Anchorage for proper autopsies. The crime scene photographers documented everything, creating a record that would be used in the eventual trial. Jake Wilson's 2 companions were identified as Thomas Brennan, 27, wanted for armed robbery, and Marcus, 25, wanted for drug distribution. Both had lengthy criminal records. In death, they became footnotes to a larger tragedy, their own crimes overshadowed by the senseless murder they'd stumbled upon. As the investigation continued, Cornelius found himself thinking about the nature of isolation. Alaska's vast spaces gave people room to live as they chose, but that same isolation could breed obsession, paranoia, and violence. When your nearest neighbor was miles away, conflicts had no buffer, no community to intervene before things escalated. He interviewed Silas again before he was transferred to Anchorage for medical treatment and formal booking. The man seemed to have aged a decade in days, his shoulder wound infected despite treatment, his eyes hollow. "Do you understand what you've done?" Cornelius asked. Silas looked at him with disturbing clarity. "I protected my land, my family's legacy. That's all I've ever done." "You killed 2 innocent people." "Innocent?" Silas's voice rose. "They were going to destroy everything, bring in tourists, development, change. This place would have become like everywhere else. Generic, profitable, dead. The development was already canceled. They weren't selling." For the first time, Silas showed emotion beyond anger. His face crumpled, and he began to sob. "What?" "The developers pulled out a week before you killed them. There's a letter. The Whitfields weren't selling. You killed them for nothing." Silas's sobs echoed through the small medical facility. It was the sound of a man realizing he'd destroyed everything he'd meant to protect. The legal proceedings moved slowly. Jake Wilson pled guilty to criminal trespass and tampering with evidence, receiving 5 years with the possibility of parole in 2. He testified against Silas, though his testimony wasn't really needed given the physical evidence and Silas's own confession. Silas Brennan was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. His lawyer attempted an insanity defense, arguing that isolation and grief over his wife's death had impaired his judgment. The prosecution countered with the months of planning evident in his journals. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. At sentencing, the Whitfield's daughter, Sarah, who lived in Seattle, gave a victim impact statement that haunted everyone who heard it. "My parents moved to Alaska for the peace and beauty. They loved their neighbors, even Silas. They would have given him the water rights if they'd known how much it meant to him. They weren't greedy people. They were teachers who retired to a place they thought was paradise. Instead, they were murdered by someone they considered a friend, over a business deal that never even happened." Silas was sentenced to life without parole. He lasted 3 years in Spring Creek Correctional Center before dying of a heart attack, alone in his cell. The Whitfield property eventually went to Sarah, who couldn't bear to keep it. She sold it to a conservation group that preserved it as wilderness, ensuring no development would ever occur. The water rights were included in the conservation easement. In a bitter irony, Silas had gotten what he wanted. The land remained untouched. It had only cost 5 lives, including ultimately his own. 6 months after the incident, Cornelius returned to the valley for a follow-up investigation on an unrelated matter. He drove past the Whitfield cabin, now boarded up and slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness. Snow had collapsed part of the roof. Animals had found ways inside. In another decade, it would be just another ruin in the Alaska wilderness. A reminder that humans had once tried to carve out lives in this unforgiving place. He stopped at Martha Henderson's cabin, checking on the now smaller community. She offered him coffee and they sat in her kitchen, looking out at the valley. "It's quieter now," she said. "Not just because of what happened. People are leaving. The young ones don't want to live this isolated anymore. Maybe Silas was right about one thing. This way of life is ending, just not the way he thought." "Do you regret staying?" Cornelius asked. Martha was quiet for a moment. "Every place has its ghosts. Here, they're just a little closer to the surface. The isolation strips away the pretense. You see people for who they really are. Sometimes that's beautiful. Sometimes it's terrible, but it's always true." As Cornelius drove back down the mountain, he thought about her words. The Alaska wilderness did strip away pretense, revealed the core of human nature. In Silas Brennan, it had revealed obsession and violence. In the Whitfields, it had shown a couple seeking peace in their final years. In Jake Wilson and his companions, desperation and poor judgment. And in himself, Cornelius wasn't sure. He'd done his job, solved the case, brought what justice was possible. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the isolation had revealed something in him too, a growing unease with the vast, empty spaces where civilization was just a thin line against the darkness. He requested a transfer to Anchorage not long after. The city had its own problems, its own violence, but at least there were witnesses, backup, community. In the wilderness, he'd learned, people could disappear into their obsessions, their fears, their anger, with no one to pull them back from the edge. The Whitfield case became required study at the Alaska Law Enforcement Training Academy, an example of how a routine welfare check could spiral into multiple homicides. But for Cornelius, it remained something more personal. A reminder that in Alaska's isolation, the distance between neighbor and killer could be measured in a single, terrible decision. Years later, when young troopers asked him about working the remote areas, he would tell them, "The wilderness is beautiful, but it's not your friend." And the people who choose that isolation, they're either running from something or towards something. Either way, approach with caution, because when things go wrong out there, they go wrong fast, and help is very far away. 2 years after the Whitfield murders, Cornelius was working a routine patrol shift in Anchorage when dispatch forwarded him an unusual request. Sarah Whitfield, the victim's daughter, wanted to speak with him specifically. She was in Alaska, staying at a hotel downtown. Cornelius met her at a coffee shop near the courthouse. Sarah looked older than her 43 years, grief having carved permanent lines around her eyes. She clutched a manila envelope like it contained something precious or dangerous. "Thank you for meeting me," she said. "I know this is unusual, but I've discovered something about my parents' deaths. Something that wasn't in the trial." Cornelius tensed. The case had been closed, Silas convicted, and now dead. "What kind of something?" Sarah opened the envelope and pulled out a collection of old letters, photographs, and documents. "I've been going through my parents' things. Finally, had the strength to do it. I found these hidden in my father's workshop, in a lockbox I didn't know existed. The documents were dated from the 1970s through the 1990s. Legal papers, correspondence, photographs of a younger Ezra Whitfield with various people, including one that made Cornelius's breath catch. Ezra standing with a younger Silas Brennan and a woman who must have been Patricia, Silas's late wife. They knew each other before. Cornelius said, "before your parents moved to Alaska." "They weren't just acquaintances," Sarah said. "Look at this." She handed him a legal document from 1978. It was a business partnership agreement between Ezra Whitfield and Silas Brennan for a logging operation in Oregon. The partnership had dissolved acrimoniously in 1981, with accusations of embezzlement on both sides. "My parents never mentioned knowing Silas before Alaska," Sarah continued. "When they moved here in 2010, they acted like they were meeting all their neighbors for the first time. But they deliberately bought property next to someone they'd had a bitter business dispute with 30 years earlier." Cornelius studied the documents more carefully. Court records showed the partnership dissolution had been ugly. Ezra had accused Silas of stealing funds. Silas had countered that Ezra had sabotaged equipment and destroyed records. The case had been settled out of court, but both men had lost significant money. Why would your parents move next to someone they'd had this kind of history with? Sarah pulled out another document. A letter from Prudence to her sister, dated 6 months before the murders. "Dear Catherine, the plan is working better than we hoped. S still doesn't recognize us. The years have changed us all so much, and using my maiden name helped. E was right that S would become obsessed with the water rights. It's like Oregon all over again, but this time we're prepared. This time we'll make sure he loses everything, just like we did. The developers are very interested, and S is already showing signs of the same paranoia that destroyed his business before. It's almost too easy. By spring, he'll either be bankrupt trying to match their offer, or driven half-mad watching his valley developed. Either way, we win." Cornelius felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "Your parents were deliberately provoking Silas. They were trying to destroy him." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "It was revenge. For something that happened before I was even born. They spent their retirement planning to psychologically torture a man who'd wronged them decades ago." The implications reframed everything about the case. The Whitfields hadn't been innocent victims. They'd been engaged in a calculated campaign of revenge, using the water rights and development deal as weapons against someone they knew was mentally fragile after his wife's death. "There's more," Sarah said, pulling out a journal in her father's handwriting. The entries detailed their plan. Research showed Silas had moved to Alaska in 2005, after Patricia was diagnosed with cancer, seeking isolation and peace. The Whitfields had tracked him down and deliberately purchased the adjacent property. They'd contacted developers, specifically to trigger Silas's fears about losing the land. They'd recorded his increasingly agitated visits, planning to use them for restraining orders that would force him to sell the final entry, dated 2 days before the murders. S is close to breaking. One more push should do it. "They didn't know the developers had pulled out," Cornelius said. "They thought the pressure was still on. They pushed a mentally unstable man to his breaking point for revenge," Sarah said, "and it got them killed." Cornelius sat back, processing this information. Legally, it changed nothing. Silas had murdered 2 people, but morally, ethically, the case had become much more complex. The Whitfields had been playing a dangerous game with someone they knew was potentially violent. "Why are you showing me this?" he asked. "Because I need someone else to know the truth. My parents weren't the innocent victims everyone thinks. They were cruel, vindictive people who spent years planning to destroy someone. And in the end, their cruelty came back on them." She gathered the documents back into the envelope. "I'm not going public with this. It wouldn't serve any purpose now. But I needed someone from law enforcement to know. To understand that sometimes victims and perpetrators aren't clearly defined." After Sarah left, Cornelius sat in his patrol car for a long time, thinking about the case that had seemed so clear-cut. The Whitfields had essentially orchestrated their own murders through their campaign of psychological warfare. Silas, already unstable from grief and isolation, had been deliberately pushed past his breaking point. He decided to drive back up to Hatcher Pass one more time. The road was clear, summer having melted the snow that had made that November night so treacherous. The Whitfield cabin had been demolished, the land cleared. But Silas's cabin still stood, abandoned and slowly rotting. Cornelius walked through Silas's property. In the workshop, he found more evidence of the man's deteriorating mental state. Walls covered with paranoid scribblings about the Whitfields, about developers, about threats to the land. But knowing now that some of his paranoia was justified, that the Whitfields really were conspiring against him, made it all more tragic. Martha Henderson still lived in the valley. When Cornelius stopped by, she wasn't surprised by the revelation. "I always wondered," she said. "The Whitfields were too interested in Silas from the day they arrived. Always asking questions about him, his habits, his state of mind. I thought they were just being neighborly, but looking back..." Did Silas ever mention knowing them before? Never. But he did say once that Ezra reminded him of someone from his past, someone he'd rather forget. I think part of him knew, subconsciously. Maybe that's why he reacted so strongly to their presence. As Cornelius drove back to Anchorage, he thought about the nature of truth in criminal cases. The legal truth was simple. Silas Brennan had murdered Ezra and Prudence Whitfield. But the human truth was far more complex. A decades-old grievance, a calculated revenge plot. Two people using an isolated valley as a battlefield for ancient wounds. He never officially reported what Sarah had shown him. There was no legal reason to do so, but he kept copies of some of the documents, filing them with his personal papers on the case. A reminder that victims and villains weren't always clearly defined, that sometimes people orchestrated their own tragedies through cruelty and obsession. The case changed how he approached domestic disputes and neighbor conflicts. He learned to look deeper, to ask about history, about patterns. How many other conflicts had roots stretching back decades? How many victims were also provocateurs? How many criminals were also victims? A year later, Cornelius heard that Sarah had sold all her parents' assets and donated the money to mental health services in rural Alaska. She included a note with the donation. "In memory of all victims of isolation and obsession, whatever form it takes." The conservation group that owned the Whitfield land reported strange things. Equipment, vandalism, threatening notes, signs that someone was camping on the property illegally. Local teens said the place was haunted, that you could sometimes see lights in the ruins of the cabin at night. Cornelius knew it was probably just drifters or kids, but part of him wondered if some echo of all that hatred and revenge still lingered in that valley. He only returned to the site once more, 5 years after the murders, accompanying a new trooper who was being trained in rural response. They stood where the Whitfield cabin had been, looking out over the valley that had cost so many lives. "What really happened here?" the younger trooper asked, having heard various versions of the story. Cornelius thought about how to answer. The simple version: neighbor killed neighbors over water rights. Or the complex truth about revenge, mental illness, isolation, and the dangerous games people play with each other's sanity. Two people tried to destroy a man psychologically and discovered he could destroy them physically, he finally said. Everyone lost. The young trooper looked confused, expecting a clearer narrative of good and evil. But Cornelius had learned that Alaska's isolation didn't create simple stories. It revealed the complex, often dark truth of human nature. that victims could be cruel, killers could be victims, and justice was sometimes just counting the bodies and assigning blame as best you could. As they drove away, Cornelius took one last look at the valley. It was beautiful in the afternoon sun, mountains rising on all sides, the creek that held those disputed water rights gurgling peacefully through the meadow. You'd never know that 5 people had died because of this place, this water, these few acres of wilderness. But Alaska kept its secrets poorly. Scratch the surface of any isolated community, and you'd find these stories. Conflicts that festered in isolation, old wounds that never healed, the dangerous proximity of neighbors who couldn't escape each other even in all that vastness. The Whitfield case officially remained a simple murder in the files. Silas Brennan, driven by greed and paranoia, had killed his neighbors over water rights. But Cornelius knew the truth was written in those hidden documents, in decades-old court records, in the calculated cruelty of a revenge plot that had spiraled into murder. Some nights, when he was working late in Anchorage, he'd think about that valley, about the Whitfields, planning their revenge in their cabin, documenting Silas's deterioration with satisfaction, about Silas, feeling the walls closing in, not knowing he was being deliberately tortured by ghosts from his past, about Jake Wilson and his dead companions, criminals who'd stumbled into someone else's tragedy and become collateral damage. The Alaska wilderness was vast enough to lose yourself in, but not vast enough to escape the past. The Whitfields had learned that fatally. They'd traveled thousands of miles and decades of time to exact their revenge, only to discover that pushing someone to their breaking point meant being there when they broke. Cornelius kept Sarah's revelation to himself, carrying it like so many other secrets accumulated over a career in law enforcement. The knowledge that victims weren't always innocent, that killers weren't always evil, that sometimes tragedy was the inevitable result of human cruelty meeting human fragility in the isolation of the far north. The valley remained empty after that, the conservation group eventually abandoning their plans to maintain it. It reverted to true wilderness, the ruins of both cabins disappearing under growth and weather. But locals still avoided it, some primitive instinct warning them that this was a place where civilization had failed, where the veneer had cracked and shown the darkness beneath. For Cornelius, the Whitfield case became the defining moment of his career, not because he'd solved it or survived it, but because it had shown him the true nature of human conflict in isolation. Strip away society, law, witnesses, and what remained was raw human nature, capable of both calculated cruelty and explosive violence, of planning revenge for decades and murdering in moments. He never forgot Sarah's words. Sometimes victims and perpetrators aren't clearly defined. In the isolation of Alaska, he'd learned, everyone was capable of becoming either. It just depended on who broke first. 7 years had passed since the Whitfield murders when Cornelius received a call that would provide the final, disturbing piece of the puzzle. He was a week from retirement, clearing out his desk in Anchorage, when Martha Henderson's niece contacted him. Martha had died of a stroke, and while cleaning out her cabin, the niece had found something Martha had insisted be given to Trooper Blackwood, who worked the Whitfield case. Cornelius drove up to the valley one last time. The road had been improved, paved in, sections where it had once been gravel. New cabins dotted the landscape, weekend retreats for Anchorage residents. The isolation that had defined the valley was slowly being eroded by development, exactly what Silas had feared. Martha's niece, a woman named Jennifer, met him at the cabin. She handed him a sealed envelope with his name on it, along with a wooden box. "Aunt Martha was very specific," Jennifer said. "She said you were the only one who would understand what to do with this." Inside the envelope was a letter in Martha's shaky handwriting. Trooper Blackwood. By the time you read this, I'll be gone, and perhaps that's for the best. I've carried this secret for 7 years, and I can't take it to my grave without someone knowing the truth. I was there the night Silas killed the Whitfields. Not in the cabin, but watching from the tree line. I'd gone to check on some trap lines and saw Silas's truck at their place. Something made me stay and watch instead of announcing myself. I saw it happen through the window. But what you need to know is that Prudence saw me. Our eyes met as Silas was strangling her. She could have screamed, could have pointed me out to Silas. Instead, she smiled. She smiled and nodded, like she was giving me permission to leave, to not interfere. I think she wanted to die. I think both of them did. Their revenge had consumed them so completely that when it brought death to their door, they welcomed it. But that's not the worst part. Look in the box. With trembling hands, Cornelius opened the wooden box. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Pictures of the Whitfields taken from a distance, documenting their daily routines. Pictures of Silas, working on his property, unaware he was being watched. Pictures of Jake Wilson and his companions arriving at the cabin, staying there, going through the Whitfields' belongings. And then, at the bottom, older photographs. Pictures from Oregon in the 1970s. Young versions of Ezra, Prudence, Silas, and Patricia. But there was a fifth person in many of the photos, a younger Martha Henderson. Cornelius looked up at Jennifer. "Did your aunt ever mention living in Oregon?" "Briefly, when she was young. She said she made mistakes there and came to Alaska for a fresh start." "Why?" The final photograph answered that question. It was a newspaper clipping from 1981. Local woman testifies in business fraud case. The woman in the photo was unmistakably Martha, 30 years younger. She had been the bookkeeper for Brennan Whitfield Logging. She had been the key witness whose testimony had destroyed both Silas's and Ezra's cases against each other, revealing that both men had been embezzling. Both had been lying. Martha had destroyed all their lives with her testimony, then fled to Alaska. And by horrible coincidence, or was it, all three had ended up in the same remote valley decades later. Cornelius read Martha's letter again, understanding dawning. Martha had recognized them all. She'd watched this tragedy unfold over years, knowing the history, understanding the motivations, and had done nothing to prevent it. She'd photographed it all like some morbid documentarian. There was one more item in the box, a small digital recorder. Cornelius played it, hearing Martha's voice, recorded just days before her death. "I came to Alaska to escape what I'd done in Oregon. I was young, stupid, having an affair with Ezra while working for the company. When it went bad, when Patricia found out and told Silas, everything exploded. My testimony was revenge against Ezra for ending things with me, and against Silas for firing me. I destroyed them all out of spite. I thought Alaska was far enough. Then Silas showed up in 2005, but he didn't recognize me. Age and hard living had changed me that much. I thought I was safe. Then the Whitfields came in 2010. They didn't recognize me either, but I knew why they were here. They'd tracked Silas down just like I'd kept track of all of them over the years. I could have warned Silas. Could have told the Whitfields I knew who they were. Could have prevented it all. But I wanted to see how it would end. After 30 years, we were all back in the same place, and I wanted to see who would destroy whom this time. I documented everything. Every conversation I overheard. Every escalation in the conflict. I was outside the cabin that night because I knew it was coming to a head. I'd heard Silas muttering to himself at the general store about ending it. I could have called you, Trooper. could have prevented those murders. But when I saw Prudence's face, saw her accept death rather than call for help, I understood. We were all already dead. Had been since Oregon. We were just ghosts acting out the final scene of a tragedy that started 40 years ago. The criminals showing up was the universe's joke. Random chance putting 3 fugitives in the middle of our carefully orchestrated mutual destruction. They were the only truly innocent people in that cabin. Criminals who just wanted a place to hide, stumbling into decades of hate. I'm sorry for my part in all of this. For Oregon, for staying silent, for documenting their destruction like it was entertainment. The valley is cursed because we brought our curse here. All of us who betrayed each other in Oregon, thinking we could run from what we'd done. Tell whoever needs to know, or don't. It doesn't matter now. We're all dead anyway. Cornelius stood in Martha's cabin, holding evidence of a conspiracy of silence and revenge that spanned 4 decades and thousands of miles. The Whitfield murders weren't just about water rights or even simple revenge. They were the final act of a tragedy that had started with business fraud, adultery, and betrayal in an Oregon logging town. 5 people bound by mutual destruction had somehow found their way to the same remote valley. Whether by coincidence or some darker design, they'd recreated their original conflict, and this time it had ended in blood. Jennifer was looking at him expectantly. What does all this mean? Cornelius made a decision. Your aunt witnessed a crime years ago and never reported it, but everyone involved is dead now. This is just history. He kept Martha's confession but gave Jennifer back the photographs and recorder. Destroy these, he said. They serve no purpose now. As he drove away from the valley for the final time, Cornelius thought about the nature of secrets in isolated places. Martha had watched her past catch up with her, had documented the destruction of everyone involved in that long-ago betrayal, and had kept silent. She'd been jury and audience to a tragedy she'd helped create. The official record would never reflect the truth. The Whitfield murders would remain a simple case of a neighbor killing neighbors over water rights. The complex web of betrayal, revenge, and mutual destruction that had really caused those deaths would die with the last person who knew about it. Cornelius himself. He thought about Sarah Whitfield, who'd shown him part of the truth but hadn't known about Martha's involvement. Should he tell her? Would knowing that her parents' death was part of an even larger tragedy help or hurt? In the end, he decided to let the dead keep their secrets. Sarah had found her own peace, and adding Martha's revelation would only deepen the tragedy. On his last day as a state trooper, Cornelius filed his final report on the Whitfield case, adding only a small addendum. Additional information received suggests historical connections between involved parties. No legal relevance. Case remains closed. He burned Martha's confession in his fireplace that night, watching 40 years of secrets turn to ash. But he kept one photograph, the one from Oregon showing all 5 of them together, young and unaware of how their lives would intertwine and end. A reminder that in Alaska's vastness, you could never really escape your past. It would follow you into the wilderness, wait patiently for years or decades, and eventually demand its due. The valley continued to develop. The conservation group sold the land to developers who built luxury cabins for wealthy weekenders. The water rights that Silas had killed for became part of a resort's amenities. Everything he'd feared came to pass, but there was no one left who remembered why it had mattered so much. Sometimes, when Cornelius heard about domestic disputes in isolated areas, he wondered how many were really new conflicts, and how many were old wounds festering in Alaska's isolation. How many people had come here to escape their past, only to find it waiting for them in the wilderness. The story made him think about the nature of justice. The legal system had processed the Whitfield murders as a simple homicide. Silas had been convicted and died in prison. Case closed. But the real crime had been 4 decades of betrayal and revenge, with all parties guilty and all parties victims. Martha's silence had been criminal, but she'd punished herself with 7 years of guilt before her stroke provided release. In his retirement, Cornelius occasionally drove past the developed valley. The new cabins had no idea they were built on a site of such complex tragedy. The new residents didn't know about the water rights that had supposedly triggered the murders, or the Oregon Logging Company that had been the real cause, or Martha Henderson watching from the trees as her past destroyed itself. Alaska had a way of burying its secrets under snow and time. The Whitfield case had seemed simple, a man driven to murder by greed and paranoia. Then it had revealed itself as revenge tragedy, with the victims provoking their killer. Then finally, as something even larger, a 4-decade cycle of betrayal and destruction that had claimed 5 lives and destroyed many more. But now, only Cornelius knew the full truth, and he would take it to his grave. Because some secrets were too complex for the law to process, too tragic for justice to address. Sometimes the only verdict possible was that everyone was guilty, everyone was dead, and the wilderness would eventually erase all traces of human folly. The last time he visited the valley, Cornelius stopped where Martha's cabin had been. It was a parking area now for tourists hiking to see the aurora borealis. He stood there, remembering Martha's words about them all being ghosts, acting out the final scene of a tragedy that had started 40 years ago. In a way, she'd been right. They'd all been dead since Oregon, Silas and Patricia, Ezra and Prudence, and Martha herself. They'd just taken 40 years to stop moving, to finally lie down in the Alaska wilderness and accept the death that had been chasing them since that first betrayal. The Whitfield case officially remained one of Alaska's simpler murders, a neighbor dispute over water rights that had turned violent. But Cornelius knew it was really a testament to the power of secrets, the weight of betrayal, and the terrible patience of revenge. 5 people had destroyed each other in Oregon, fled thousands of miles to Alaska, and then, through horrible coincidence or cosmic justice, had found themselves neighbors again, ready to finish what they'd started. The wilderness had just been the stage. The real killer had been the past, patient and inexorable, using water rights and isolation as weapons to complete a tragedy that had begun with simple human greed and betrayal in a logging office 4 decades ago. As he stood in the parking area, watching tourists take photos of the spectacular valley, Cornelius thought about all the secrets buried in Alaska's vastness. Every remote cabin had its stories. Every isolated valley its tragedies. The wilderness drew people who were running from something or toward something, and sometimes those 2 directions led to the same deadly end. The Whitfield murders would forever be his reminder that in law enforcement, the truth you could prove and the truth that existed were often very different things. Justice was about the former, but understanding, real understanding, required acknowledging the latter. He'd solved the case, but Martha's revelation had shown him he'd only seen the surface. Beneath it was a web of connections and betrayals that law could never fully address. In the end, the wilderness had provided its own justice, brutal, final, and indifferent to human notions of guilt or innocence. Everyone who'd betrayed someone in that Oregon logging office was dead. The valley was being developed exactly as Silas had feared. The water rights he'd killed for were now part of amenities advertised to tourists. And somewhere, in places just as isolated, similar tragedies were playing out, old wounds reopening, past betrayals demanding payment. Secrets festering in the darkness until they exploded in violence. That was the real lesson of the Whitfield case. Cornelius realized as he drove away for the last time. Not that neighbor had killed neighbor over water rights, but that in Alaska's isolation, the past was always present, waiting in the wilderness for its moment to strike. And when it did, the law could only count the bodies and assign blame to whoever was left standing. The rest, the real truth, would be buried with the dead, kept by the mountains, absorbed by the wilderness that had witnessed so much human folly and would outlast them all. Alaska kept its secrets, but sometimes it whispered them to those who knew how to listen. And Cornelius, in his retirement, had heard them all. The blizzard hit the Dalton Highway at 3 p.m. on December 18th, turning the world into a white void where sky and ground became indistinguishable. State Trooper Augustus Pike had been monitoring the weather reports all morning from his station in Coldfoot, watching the storm system barrel down from the Arctic Ocean with winds that would soon exceed 70 miles per hour. The Dalton Highway, known to locals as the Hall Road, was dangerous in perfect conditions. In a storm like this, it became a death trap. Augustus had been patrolling the Dalton for 15 years, longer than any other trooper currently assigned to this remote stretch of road that connected Fairbanks to the oil fields of Prudhoe Bay. 414 miles of mostly gravel road through some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth, where winter temperatures regularly dropped to minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and the sun disappeared entirely for 2 months of the year. The call came through at 3:47 p.m., just as visibility dropped to near zero. Dispatcher Temperance Mills, speaking through heavy static from Fairbanks, delivered the news that would begin the most harrowing 48 hours of Augustus's career. Unit 3, we have a situation. Party of 3 hunters from Anchorage, supposed to check eyelashes and beard. Classic hypothermia death. In the final stages, victims often felt warm, even hot, leading them to remove clothing. Obadiah had taken off his gloves and parka, accelerating his death. His hands were frozen into claws, his face purple-blue. Augustus photographed everything, his cold-numbed fingers barely able to operate the camera. The businessman had probably lasted less than an hour after leaving the vehicle. The other tracks continued from here, now down to 2 sets of boots. Thaddeus and James Sullivan still moving, but their gait showing increasing stumbling and confusion. He followed the trail into a narrow valley where the wind dropped slightly. Here, he found evidence of what had really happened. Shell casings in the snow. 308 Winchester, hunting rounds. Multiple shots fired in different directions. Blood on the snow, not much, but enough to indicate injury. The men had been shooting at something. Augustus studied the scene carefully. No animal tracks. No sign of what they'd been shooting at. Just their own footprints, increasingly chaotic, and the spent brass. They'd been hallucinating. It happened in extreme cold and stress. The mind created threats that weren't there. They'd wasted ammunition, energy, and most importantly, time shooting at phantoms while the real killer, the cold, closed in. The blood trail led him another quarter-mile to the second body. James Sullivan had fallen into a shallow ravine, breaking his leg in the fall based on the unnatural angle. He'd tried to crawl out, his fingers worn bloody from clawing at the frozen ground. The blood from his leg wound had frozen, creating red ice crystals around the injury. He'd died slowly, probably conscious until near the end. One set of tracks continued. Thaddeus, the experienced guide, still moving but no longer in a straight line. The pattern showed someone in the late stages of hypothermia. Paradoxical undressing had begun. Augustus found a glove, then another, then Thaddeus's parka, abandoned in the snow like breadcrumbs leading to inevitable death. The wind was picking up again. and Augustus realized he'd been out in the elements for over 2 hours. His own core temperature was dropping. He had to make a choice: continue following Thaddeus's trail, or return to his vehicle before he became another victim. He pushed on for another 10 minutes and found Thaddeus in a small cave formed by overhanging rocks. The guide was still alive. Barely. He'd built a small fire using matches and torn pages from a notebook, but it had long since died. Thaddeus was curled in a fetal position, his lips blue, his breathing shallow. "Thaddeus," Augustus said, shaking him gently. "It's Trooper Pike. I'm here to help." The guide's eyes opened, unfocused, pupils dilated. "They're out there," he mumbled through frozen lips, "in the storm, following us. We can hear them breathing. There's nothing out there, Thaddeus. It's hypothermia. You're hallucinating." No, we saw them. Tall shadows, red eyes. They herded us away from the truck, made us run." Augustus recognized the symptoms. Severe hypothermia caused vivid hallucinations, paranoia, and confusion. The brain, starved of warmth and oxygen, created its own reality. He'd seen it before, though never this severe. He tried to get Thaddeus to his feet, but the guide couldn't walk. His feet were frozen solid, early stage frostbite turning to necrosis. Augustus did the only thing he could. He activated his emergency beacon, hoping someone, somewhere, would pick up the signal. Then he used his emergency supplies to build a better shelter, wrapping Thaddeus in all the survival blankets he had. "The others?" Thaddeus asked during a moment of clarity. "Gone. I'm sorry." Thaddeus nodded slowly. "My fault. Should have stayed with the vehicle, but the voices... We heard voices calling for help. Couldn't ignore them. Had to check. There were no voices, Thaddeus. I know that now. But out there, in the storm, it all seemed so real. The mind plays tricks when you're dying, makes you see things, hear things, makes you do stupid things." Augustus stayed with him for another hour, sharing his remaining water and energy bars, trying to keep the guide conscious. But Thaddeus was slipping away, his body too damaged by the cold to recover. He died just as Augustus's emergency beacon finally got a signal through to dispatch. "Unit 3 to dispatch," Augustus called on his radio, which had finally found a gap in the interference. "I've located the hunting party. All 3 deceased, severe weather exposure. I need immediate extraction at my beacon coordinates. Augustus, this is Temperance. Extraction impossible for at least 12 hours. Storm's getting worse. Can you make it back to your vehicle?" Augustus looked at the 3 dead men, victims of the storm and their own panic-driven decisions. His own situation was deteriorating rapidly. He had to leave them and save himself, or join them in frozen death. "Attempting return to vehicle," he said. "Mark these coordinates for body recovery when weather permits." The journey back to his patrol vehicle was the hardest physical challenge of Augustus's life. The storm had worsened, visibility down to arm's length. He navigated by compass alone, each step a battle against wind that threatened to knock him down. His feet went numb, then his hands. Ice formed on his eyelashes, making it hard to keep his eyes open. He almost missed his vehicle, walking past it in the whiteout before recognizing the shape. He collapsed inside, cranking the heater to maximum, his body shaking uncontrollably as it began to warm. It took an hour before he could feel his extremities again. Another hour before he was stable enough to drive. The trip back to the highway was a nightmare of near misses and stuck wheels, but Augustus made it. Once on the Dalton, he still had to navigate through the worst blizzard in a decade to reach safety. It took him 8 hours to cover what should have been a 2-hour drive. Augustus made it back to Coldfoot Station at 4 a.m., his body running on pure adrenaline and muscle memory. Temperance was waiting, having driven up from Fairbanks despite the storm. She helped him inside, his legs barely able to support his weight after the ordeal. "Jesus, Augustus, your face," she said, examining the white patches on his cheeks and nose. "That's second-degree frostbite. We need to get you to the hospital." "After I file the report," Augustus insisted, collapsing into a chair. His hand shook as he accepted the hot coffee she offered. 3 men dead because they made every wrong decision possible. What happened out there? Augustus detailed the scene. The crashed vehicle, the abandoned supplies, the trail of bodies leading away from the only shelter they had. As he spoke, he kept thinking about Thaddeus's final words, the hallucinations the men had experienced. "They were shooting at nothing," he said. "Spent brass everywhere, but no animal tracks, no sign of any real threat. Just 3 men losing their minds in the cold, creating phantoms to explain their fear." Temperance had seen it before too. Arctic hysteria, some called it. The combination of extreme cold, disorientation, and fear could break even experienced outdoorsmen. The brain, struggling to function in hypothermic conditions, manufactured threats to explain the body's distress signals. Thaddeus kept talking about voices, Augustus continued. Said they heard someone calling for help, led them away from the vehicle. But there was nobody out there, just wind and their own paranoia. The storm continued for another 36 hours. During that time, Augustus was treated for frostbite and exhaustion at the small medical clinic in Coldfoot. The doctor, a young woman named Emily who'd come to Alaska for adventure and found only endless medical emergencies, told him he was lucky to keep all his fingers and toes. "Another hour out there and we'd be having a different conversation," she said, examining his blackened fingertips. "What made you stay out so long?" "I thought I could save them." "Thaddeus was still alive when I found him." "You couldn't have saved him, not with those injuries. Core temperature too low, too much tissue damage. You're lucky you didn't join them." When the weather finally cleared, Augustus led the recovery team back to the bodies. In daylight, without the storm, the scene looked different but no less tragic. The path the men had taken made no logical sense. They'd walked in circles at some points, backtracked at others, always moving away from potential shelter. The recovery team found something else Augustus had missed in the storm. Near where he'd found Obadiah's body, there was a small survival cache, an old hunter's supply drop from decades ago. A small shack, barely visible under the snow, containing emergency supplies, canned food, even fuel. The men had walked within 50 feet of it and never saw it. In their panic and confusion, they'd passed by salvation. They could have survived, one of the recovery team members said, shaking his head. Everything they needed was right here. Augustus thought about the cruel irony. 3 men dying of exposure within sight of shelter they couldn't see through their fear in the storm. He wondered if they'd walked past it multiple times, their deteriorating minds unable to recognize it for what it was. Back at the crashed expedition, investigators found more evidence of the men's deteriorating mental state. Obadiah's journal, recovered from his jacket, showed increasingly erratic entries as the situation worsened. 3 p.m., vehicle went off-road. Thaddeus says we can walk to shelter. 4 p.m., can't find the road. Everything looks the same, white everywhere. 5 p.m., something following us. We can all hear it. Breathing in the wind, time unknown. James shot at it but missed. It's getting closer. Why won't it show itself? Help us. They're all around now. Red eyes in the storm. Thaddeus says, run. But where? Where? The final entries were illegible, just scratches of pen on paper as his motor control failed. The investigation revealed more about what had led to the tragedy. The men had been drinking the night before at the fuel stop, celebrating their hunting trip. Not heavily, but enough to impair judgment when combined with the early stages of hypothermia after the crash. They'd had a satellite phone, but it broke in the accident. They had flares, but never used them. Every tool that could have saved them was either ignored or misused in their panic. Thaddeus's wife came to identify his body. Martha Marsh was a small, sturdy woman who'd lived in Wiseman for 40 years. She didn't cry, just nodded when she saw him. "He knew better," she said quietly. 40 years guiding in these mountains, and he knew better than to leave the vehicle. Something must have gone very wrong for him to make that choice. The crash likely caused head trauma, Augustus explained gently. Combined with the cold, it affected their judgment. They weren't thinking clearly. Martha looked at him with eyes that had seen too many Alaska winters. Thaddeus always said the mountain decides who lives and who dies. Maybe it just decided it was their time. The families of Obadiah Cross and James Sullivan flew up from Anchorage to claim the bodies. They were wealthy people, unused to death being so random and brutal. They wanted someone to blame: the guide, the weather service, the state troopers for not finding them sooner. But there was no one to blame except bad decisions made by panicking men in an unforgiving environment. Augustus was questioned extensively about his decision to follow them off-road alone, violating standard protocol. The review board ultimately cleared him, noting that while he'd broken regulations, he'd also been the only chance the men had for survival. If he'd waited for backup or better weather, he wouldn't have found Thaddeus alive, wouldn't have been able to provide those final moments of human comfort. But the incident haunted Augustus. Not because of what he'd done, but because of what the cold had done to those men's minds. The hallucinations Thaddeus described were so vivid, so real to them, that they'd fled from imaginary threats into the arms of a very real death. He researched the phenomenon, learning about paradoxical undressing, terminal burrowing, and the various ways hypothermia affected the brain. In the final stages, victims often experienced a sense of peace, even euphoria. Some reported seeing loved ones who died, hearing music, feeling warm and safe even as their bodies shut down. The brain, starved of oxygen and glucose, created its own reality to ease the transition from life to death. 2 months after the incident, Augustus received a package from Martha Marsh. Inside was Thaddeus's personal journal, the one he'd kept for decades of guiding. She'd marked a page from 5 years earlier. Took 2 lawyers from Anchorage out today. City boys with expensive gear and no sense. They wanted to hunt in December, wouldn't listen when I told them about the storms. Money talks louder than sense sometimes. I agreed, but I shouldn't have. The mountain doesn't forgive arrogance, and I'm enabling theirs. One day, this kind of thing will kill me, but the money's too good to refuse. The entry was prophetic in its accuracy. Thaddeus had known the risks of taking inexperienced hunters into dangerous conditions. He'd done it anyway for the substantial guide fees wealthy clients paid. In the end, his compromise with safety had cost 3 lives. Augustus returned to regular patrol duty, but the Dalton Highway felt different now. Every blizzard, every whiteout, he thought about those 3 men walking in circles, shooting at shadows, dying within sight of salvation they couldn't see. He became more insistent about safety protocols, more vocal about the dangers of winter travel to anyone who would listen. He gave talks at community centers from Fairbanks to Prudhoe Bay, showing photos from the scene, explaining how quickly things could go wrong. He'd tell audiences about the survival cache the men had walked past, the supplies in their vehicle they'd abandoned, the flares they never lit. The cold doesn't just kill your body, he'd say. It kills your mind first. makes you see things that aren't there, make decisions that don't make sense. Your brain becomes your enemy, telling you to run when you should stay still, telling you you're hot when you're freezing, showing you threats that don't exist while hiding the real danger. One evening, after a particularly difficult presentation where family members of the victims were present, Augustus was approached by an old Inupiaq elder named Joseph. The man had lived in the Arctic all his life, had seen countless people claimed by the cold. "You did right trying to save them," Joseph said. "But you need to understand something. When men see monsters in the storm, sometimes they're seeing their own death approaching. The mind knows what the body hasn't accepted yet. Those shadows they shot at, that was death walking beside them, waiting for them to fall." "You believe they really saw something?" Joseph shrugged. "I believe the boundary between life and death gets thin in the cold. Maybe they saw through to the other side. Maybe their minds showed them what was coming. Does it matter? Dead is dead." The old man walked away, leaving Augustus with a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. He thought about Thaddeus's description of red eyes in the storm, of being herded away from the vehicle. What if the hallucinations weren't random? What if the dying brain, in its final moments, perceived something real that the living couldn't see? He pushed the thought away. That way led to madness, to the same kind of paranoid thinking that had killed 3 men in a blizzard. The truth was simpler and more tragic. 3 men had died because they panicked, because the cold broke their minds before it stopped their hearts. But sometimes, during the long Arctic nights when he patrolled the empty highway, Augustus would see shadows moving in the storms. His rational mind knew it was just wind and snow and tired eyes. But a deeper part, the primitive part that had kept humans alive for millennia, whispered warnings about things that hunted in the White Death, things that used the cold as camouflage. He never mentioned these thoughts in his safety presentations, never told anyone about the momentary certainty he'd felt in that canyon, finger on the trigger, that something had been watching them. Because that was how it started. A moment of doubt, a flicker of paranoia, and suddenly you were running into the storm, fleeing from shadows while the real killer crept through your veins, freezing you from the inside out. 6 months after the incident, Augustus was back on regular patrol when another storm system moved in from the Arctic. This one was predicted to be worse than the December blizzard, with temperatures dropping to -50 and winds exceeding 80 miles per hour. The state issued emergency warnings, closing the Dalton Highway to all but essential traffic. Augustus was stationed at the checkpoint near Coldfoot, turning back travelers who thought they could beat the storm. Most complied, understanding the danger. But there were always a few who insisted they knew better, who had urgent business in Prudhoe Bay or Fairbanks that couldn't wait. Around 2 p.m., just as the storm's leading edge arrived, a convoy of 3 vehicles approached the checkpoint. They were oil field workers, driving company trucks back to Prudhoe Bay after a rotation. The lead driver, a burly man named Carl, argued with Augustus about the closure. "Look, trooper, we've driven this road 100 times. We know what we're doing. If we don't get back, the whole operation shuts down." "The road is closed," Augustus said firmly. "No exceptions. There's lodging in Coldfoot, waited out. You don't understand. We've got critical equipment in these trucks. It can't freeze." Augustus had heard every excuse, every rationalization, but after what he'd seen in December, he wouldn't bend. "Sir, 3 experienced outdoorsmen died in the last blizzard, less than 10 miles from here. The road is closed." Carl's expression changed when Augustus mentioned the deaths. Everyone on the Dalton had heard about the hunters, how they'd been found frozen, how they'd walked past shelter in their panic. That was different, Carl said, but his voice had lost its edge. They crashed, got disoriented. And what happens when you crash? When visibility drops to zero and you can't see the road? When your truck breaks down and you have to choose between staying with a cooling vehicle or walking for help? The convoy reluctantly turned back to Coldfoot. Augustus watched them go, knowing he might have just saved their lives. The storm that hit over the next 72 hours was the worst in a decade. Even in Coldfoot, buildings shook from the wind. Power failed repeatedly. The temperature gauge at the station bottomed out at minus 60 degrees. On the second night of the storm, Augustus was monitoring emergency frequencies when he picked up a faint distress signal. It was broken, intermittent, but he could make out key words. Emergency, mile 211, medical, dying. Mile marker 211 was 50 miles north, deep in the closed section of highway. Someone had ignored the barriers, driven around the checkpoints, and was now in trouble. Augustus tried to respond, but got no reply. The signal came twice more, weaker each time, then nothing. He faced a terrible decision. Attempting rescue in these conditions was almost certainly suicide, but someone was dying out there. He thought about Thaddeus, how he'd still been alive when found, how those final moments of human comfort had mattered. Augustus made preparations methodically. He informed Temperance of his plan, filed a detailed route plan, and equipped his vehicle with every piece of survival gear available. He also did something he'd never done before. He wrote a letter to his sister in California, just in case. The drive north was impossibility made real. The road existed only in theory, buried under feet of drifting snow. Augustus navigated by GPS and memory, creeping along at 5 miles per hour, stopping frequently to clear ice from his windshield. The wind hit his vehicle so hard it slid sideways even at minimal speed. It took him 6 hours to cover 40 miles. His fuel consumption was triple normal due to the conditions. He began to wonder if he'd have enough to get back. At mile marker 205, he found evidence of recent passage. Deep ruts in the snow where a vehicle had plowed through before the worst of the storm. At mile 211 he found them. Not one vehicle, but two. A pickup truck had gone off the road, rolling down an embankment. A second vehicle, an SUV, was parked on the shoulder, emergency lights still flashing weakly through the snow. Augustus approached carefully, weapon drawn out of habit more than real concern. The SUV was running but nearly out of fuel, the engine sputtering. Inside, he found a family of 4, parents and 2 teenage children, huddled together, semi-conscious from carbon monoxide poisoning. The vehicle's exhaust pipe was partially blocked by snow, causing deadly fumes to back up into the cabin. He immediately shut off the engine and opened all doors, letting Arctic air flood in. The family stirred, gasping. The father, a native Alaskan named William, tried to speak, but could only gesture weakly toward the embankment. Augustus understood. Someone else was down there. He grabbed his emergency kit and rappelled down to the pickup. Inside was an elderly man, unconscious but alive, with a severe head wound. The truck's cab had protected him from the worst of the cold, but he was in critical condition. Augustus recognized him, Thomas Appett, a respected elder from one of the North Slope villages. Getting Thomas up the embankment took every ounce of strength Augustus had. The old man was dead weight, and the slope was ice-covered. Twice Augustus slipped, nearly sending them both tumbling back down. His muscles screamed, his lungs burned from the frozen air, but he managed to get Thomas to the road. Now he had 5 victims and 1 working vehicle. The family was recovering from the carbon monoxide, but they were weak and confused. Thomas needed immediate medical attention, and the storm was getting worse. Augustus made the only decision he could. He loaded everyone into his patrol vehicle. 6 people crammed into a space meant for 4. He gave his outer layer of Arctic gear to the teenagers, knowing he was sacrificing his own protection against the cold. The drive back was a nightmare of overwhelming responsibility. Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness, his breathing increasingly labored. The mother, Sarah, held him steady while William tried to keep pressure on the head wound. The teenagers, boy and girl perhaps 15 and 13, were silent with shock. Augustus pushed the vehicle as fast as he dared, but speed meant risk. One mistake, one slide off the road, and they'd all die. He could feel hypothermia beginning in his extremities, his reduced clothing insufficient for the temperature. His fingers went numb on the steering wheel. His vision began to tunnel. "Stay awake, trooper," William said, recognizing the signs. "Talk to us. Keep your mind working." Augustus talked about anything and everything: his training, his family, the December incident. Anything to keep his brain functioning as his body temperature dropped. Sarah rubbed his shoulders, trying to keep his circulation going. The teenagers shared their body heat, pressing close despite the awkwardness. They were 20 miles from Coldfoot when Augustus started hallucinating. He saw shapes in the snow, figures walking alongside the vehicle. His rational mind knew they weren't real, but they seemed so vivid. He bit his cheek hard, using pain to maintain focus. "I see them too," the younger teenager, the girl, said quietly. "The snow people. Grandma says they come when death is close. They're not real," Augustus forced himself to say. "Just our brains reacting to the cold." "I know," she replied, "but knowing doesn't make them go away." 15 miles from Coldfoot, the engine began to sputter. They were running on fumes. Augustus did the math. They wouldn't make it. He radioed ahead, giving their position but got no response. The storm was blocking everything. 10 miles out, the engine died. The silence was immediate and terrifying. No heater, no movement, just the howling wind, and the rapid cooling of the vehicle's interior. Augustus knew they had minutes before the cold became lethal. "Everyone out," he ordered. "We walk." "We'll die out there," William protested. "We'll die in here for certain." "At least moving gives us a chance." They wrapped Thomas in every piece of spare clothing and made a crude sled from the vehicle's floor mats. Augustus took the lead, breaking trail through waist-deep snow. William and his son dragged Thomas. Sarah and her daughter followed, holding on to each other. The 10-mile walk to Coldfoot became an epic of endurance. Every step was agony. The wind cut exposed skin like knives. Augustus's vision narrowed to the next step, then the next. He navigated by instinct and stubbornness, refusing to stop even when his body screamed for rest. He knew if they stopped, they'd never start again. He'd seen it with the hunters. Once you gave in to the cold's seductive promise of rest, you were finished. So he kept moving, one foot in front of the other, leading 5 people through a white hell. They were found 2 miles from Coldfoot by a search party Temperance had organized when Augustus missed his check-in. He was told later that he'd been carrying the teenage girl for the last mile, though he had no memory of picking her up. His body had been operating on pure survival instinct. His conscious mind shut down to conserve energy. Augustus spent 3 days in the hospital, being treated for severe hypothermia and frostbite. He lost 2 toes and partial feeling in his left hand. Thomas Apput survived, though with permanent brain damage from his injuries. The family recovered fully. Their carbon monoxide exposure caught just in time. During his recovery, Augustus was visited by the family. William brought traditional native Alaskan food, insisting it would help him heal. Sarah cried, thanking him repeatedly. The teenagers were quiet, but the girl, whose name was Mary, left him a drawing. Simple figures walking through stylized snow, with one figure leading the others toward a light. "You saw them too, didn't you?" she asked. "The snow people. But you didn't let them make you stop." Augustus thought about denying it, maintaining the rational explanation. But he just nodded. They'd shared something in that storm. A glimpse of how thin the line was between life and death, between reality and hallucination. The incident earned Augustus a commendation and an unwanted reputation as a hero. Media outlets wanted interviews about his miraculous rescue. He declined them all. There'd been no miracle, just stubborn refusal to give in to the cold. And luck, incredible, unearned luck, that the search party had found them when they did. But the rescue had cost him more than toes. The hallucinations in the storm, the shadow figures he'd seen and ignored, had shaken something loose in his psyche. He found himself seeing movement in his peripheral vision even in clear weather. His dreams were filled with frozen faces and whispered warnings about things that hunted in the white. Augustus returned to duty after 2 months of medical leave, but the Dalton Highway felt different now. His left hand, partially numb from frostbite damage, made weapon handling difficult. He compensated, retraining himself, but the constant reminder of his vulnerability gnawed at him. The missing toes affected his balance, requiring special orthotic boots. The physical therapist said he'd adapt, and he did, but adaptation and acceptance were different things. His first patrol back was on a clear March day, temperature a balmy -10, perfect conditions by Arctic standards. But even in broad daylight, Augustus found himself checking his mirrors constantly, looking for shapes that shouldn't be there. The trauma counselor the department had mandated he see called it hypervigilance, a normal response to near-death experiences. Augustus called it seeing clearly for the first time. 3 weeks into his return, another welfare check came in. An elderly prospector named Josiah Henley hadn't been seen in Wiseman for over a month. His cabin was 40 miles off the highway, accessible only by snowmobile in winter. Augustus felt his chest tighten when he got the assignment. "I can send someone else," Temperance offered, reading his hesitation over the radio. "Negative. This is my job." The snowmobile ride to Henley's cabin was uneventful, but Augustus couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every raven perched in the spindly black spruce looked like an omen. Every gust of wind sounded like whispered warnings. He knew it was his mind playing tricks, residual trauma from the storm rescues, but knowing didn't stop the feeling. Henley's cabin was dark, no smoke from the chimney despite temperatures that demanded constant heat. Augustus approached carefully, announcing himself. No response. The door was unlocked. Not unusual in remote Alaska, but combined with the cold cabin, it was a bad sign. Inside, he found Josiah Henley sitting in his chair by the cold stove, frozen solid. He'd been dead for at least 2 weeks based on the condition of the body. Natural causes, it appeared. The old man had simply died in his sleep, and the cold had preserved him like a museum piece. Augustus began documenting the scene, but something felt wrong. The cabin was too neat. Henley had been a notorious pack rat, but everything was organized, cleaned, arranged. On the table was a note in shaky handwriting. "Trooper, when you find this, know I chose my time. The cancer was getting worse and I won't die in some hospital. Arranged everything so you wouldn't have a mess. Woodbox is full of my journals. 40 years of prospecting records. Give them to the Historical Society. Tell them Josiah Henley died as he lived on his own terms. P.S. Don't trust the voices in the storms. They lie. That last line made Augustus's skin crawl. He found the journals Henley mentioned, decades of detailed observations about the region. But the final entries were different. They talked about storms bringing voices, about seeing figures that walked through blizzards unaffected by wind or cold, about the mountain having its own agenda. January 3rd. Another storm coming. Can feel it in my bones, but also in my mind, like something's calling. Doc says it's the cancer spreading to my brain, causing hallucinations. Maybe, but why do all us dying folks see the same things? January 15th. They were here again last night. Standing outside the cabin, waiting. Not threatening, just waiting. Like they know something I don't. Or maybe something I do know but won't admit. Death's got many faces up here. Some wear snow like skin. January 28th, last entry. Storm tomorrow. Good day to go. Better than hospitals and tubes and strangers. If whoever finds this has seen them too, you're not crazy. The mountain shows truth to those close to crossing over. The living just choose not to see. Augustus packed the journals, sealed the cabin, and arranged for body recovery. But Henley's words stayed with him. How many others had seen things in the storms? How many had dismissed it as hallucination, as dying brains creating meaning from chaos? Over the next year, Augustus quietly researched similar accounts. He found dozens: miners, trappers, native elders, even other troopers. All reported similar experiences. Figures in storms, voices calling for help that led people astray, the feeling of being watched by something ancient and patient. Dr. Sarah Littletree, an anthropologist from the University of Alaska, had compiled many of these stories. When Augustus reached out to her, she wasn't surprised. "You've seen them?" she said, not a question. "I've seen hypothermia-induced hallucinations." She smiled knowingly. "Is that what you tell yourself? That everyone sees the exact same hallucination? That dying brains all create identical figures? The brain, under stress, follows patterns. Trooper Pike, I've interviewed over 200 people who've had near-death experiences in Arctic storms. The consistency is beyond statistical probability. Either there's something about extreme cold that triggers identical false perceptions, or what? Or they're perceiving something real that we normally can't see. The boundary between life and death isn't as solid as we pretend. Maybe, in extreme conditions, when we're close to crossing over, we see the things that wait on the other side." Augustus wanted to dismiss her ideas as academic mysticism, but he couldn't forget Mary's drawing, Henley's journals, his own experiences in the storms. The rational explanation was trauma and coincidence, but rationality had its limits in a place where nature itself could kill you in minutes. His career continued, but he was changed. He became known as the trooper who could find people in impossible conditions, who seemed to know where lost travelers would end up. He couldn't explain that he followed patterns he'd learned from studying the stories, from understanding how the storms herded people, how the voices led them astray. In December, exactly 2 years after the hunters died, Augustus was called to another rescue. A family of tourists had driven onto a closed winter road, ignoring warning signs. Their rental SUV was found abandoned, doors open, belongings scattered. The tracks led into the wilderness. Augustus found them 4 miles from their vehicle, huddled in a grove of trees. The parents were trying to shelter 3 young children, all showing signs of severe hypothermia. They were alive, but barely conscious. "We followed the light," the father mumbled, as Augustus wrapped him in emergency blankets. "Someone with a lantern, leading us to shelter." But they kept moving, kept going deeper. Augustus got them all to safety, another successful rescue added to his record. but he knew what they'd followed. The same false guides that had led. The cold plays tricks on your mind, he'd say. You'll see things, hear things. Doesn't matter if they're real or not. What matters is you don't follow them. You don't listen to voices calling for help unless you can verify the source. You don't chase lights in storms. You trust your training, your equipment, your rational mind, even when your senses tell you otherwise. One young trooper, fresh from Anchorage, asked, "But what if someone really needs help?" Then you'll find evidence. Real tracks, real vehicles, real radio calls. The mountain doesn't ask for help. It takes what it wants. Augustus retired after 25 years of service, his body too damaged by cold and injury to continue. He moved to Fairbanks, close enough to visit but far enough to avoid daily reminders. But the dreams followed him. Dreams of frozen faces, of figures in snow, of voices calling through static. He started writing his own journal, documenting every incident, every pattern he'd observed. Not for publication, but as a record. Someone needed to know what he'd learned, even if they'd never believe it. His final entry, written the night before he died peacefully in his sleep at age 68, was brief. Served the highway for 25 years. Saved 37 people from the cold. Lost 11. Those numbers should balance, but they don't. The mountain keeps its own ledger. The storms take who they want, when they want. We just pretend we have control. To whoever finds this, the voices in the storms are real. Whether they come from dying brains or dying souls doesn't matter. Don't follow them. Don't listen. The mountain is patient and hungry, and it uses our humanity against us. Our need to help, to respond, to save others. I've seen the watchers in the white. Maybe hallucination. Maybe death's reconnaissance. Maybe the mountain's immune system removing threats. Doesn't matter what they are. What matters is what they do. They sort the living from the dying. Guide the weak to their ends. Test the strong. I survived because I learned their rules. Stay with shelter. Ignore the voices. Never follow the lights. Trust nothing in a storm except your own heartbeat. And when that starts to fade, when the cold seduction begins, remember, the mountain is beautiful, but it is not your friend. Some will read this and think I lost my mind to trauma and frostbite. Maybe I did, but I saved 37 people by believing what I saw, by learning the patterns, by respecting the mountain's hunger. That's a truth worth more than rationality. The Dalton Highway is quiet tonight. No storms coming, but they will return, and with them the things that hunt in the White Death. Someone else will take my place, will learn what I learned, will face the same impossible choice. Believe the reasonable explanation, or trust what you see when death stands close enough to touch. I choose to believe. Not in monsters or spirits, but in patterns. In the consistency of stories told by the dying. In the wisdom of fear. The mountain doesn't care what we call the things that walk its storms. It only cares that we feed it one way or another. Augustus Pike, Alaska State Trooper, retired. Witness to the white. The journal was found by his niece when settling his estate. She donated it to the Alaska State Trooper Museum, where it sits in archives, occasionally read by researchers studying the psychological effects of extreme cold on law enforcement personnel. But every trooper who patrols the Dalton Highway knows about Augustus Pike. They know about the rescues, the lost toes, the voices he heard but never followed. And on the worst nights when storms turn the world white and radios fail and help is hours away, they remember his words. Trust nothing in a storm except your own heartbeat. Some say it's just good advice about hypothermia and hallucinations. Others, those who've been out in the White Death, who've heard the voices and seen the shadows, know it's something more. A warning. a guide, a truth that can't be proven but can't be ignored. The Dalton Highway still claims lives every winter. People still disappear into storms, following things that may or may not exist. And troopers still patrol those empty miles, watching for the lost, listening for distress calls, and trying not to think about what else might be out there in the white, waiting for the temperature to drop and the storms to rise. The mountain keeps its secrets, and its hunger is never fully satisfied. But Augustus Pike's legacy lives on in every trooper who ignores the voices, who stays with their vehicle, who chooses rationality over the seductive call of the storm. Whether saving them from hallucinations or something more ancient and patient, the result is the same. They live to patrol another day. And in the end, in a place where death comes dressed in white and whispers with the wind, survival is the only truth that matters. The call came through to the Bethel station at 11:15 p.m. on a moonless January night. The woman's voice barely audible through the static that plagued communications in the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. State Trooper Barnabas Cole had just finished his paperwork from a domestic dispute in Kwethluk when dispatcher Hannah patched through the emergency call. "State Police, we need help in Nukarluk," the woman said, her voice tight with fear. "Please, something terrible is happening. They're not themselves. There's been violence." Barnabas knew Nukarluk, a village of maybe 90 people, 60 miles upriver from Bethel, accessible only by boat in summer or snowmobile in winter. No roads, no regular law enforcement presence. The kind of place where disputes were usually handled by village elders without outside interference. "Ma'am, this is Trooper Cole. Can you identify yourself?" Constance Nayak. "I work at the school. Please, you have to come. Elder Zebediah is dead, others too, and Josiah Akiak has locked his family in their house. We can hear them screaming." The line crackled, her voice fading in and out. Barnabas tried to get more information, but the connection died completely. He attempted to call back on the village's satellite phone, but got no answer. Nukarluk going dark was unusual, but not unprecedented. Winter storms often knocked out communications, but multiple deaths and ongoing violence demanded immediate response, regardless of conditions or the 3-hour snowmobile journey through unmarked terrain. Barnabas had been stationed in Bethel for 8 years, covering dozens of remote villages scattered across the Delta. He'd seen alcohol-fueled violence, domestic disputes that escalated to murder, and the occasional suicide cluster that devastated small communities. But something in Constance's voice suggested this was different. The controlled panic of someone witnessing something beyond normal village dysfunction. He prepared methodically, extra ammunition for his service weapon, emergency medical supplies, satellite phone, GPS beacon, cold weather gear rated to -60. The temperature outside was -35, with wind chill dropping it to -50. A breakdown on the trail would mean death within hours. The journey to Nukarluk followed the frozen Kuskokwim River for 30 miles before branching onto smaller tributaries. In darkness, with only headlights to guide him, Barnabas navigated by memory and GPS, the snowmobile's engine the only sound in the Arctic silence. No aurora tonight, just black sky and endless white beneath. As he approached the village, Barnabas expected to see lights, smoke from chimneys, some sign of life. Instead, Nukarluk was dark. Not a single light visible, though it was only 2:30 a.m. and someone should have been awake, especially if violence had occurred. The silence was complete. No generators running, no dogs barking, nothing. He stopped at the village edge, shutting off his engine to listen. The absence of sound was wrong. Even sleeping villages had ambient noise, wind through buildings, occasional dog movements. the creak of structures in the cold. This was tomb-like quiet. Barnabas drew his weapon and activated his flashlight, the beam cutting through darkness to reveal the village's main path. Fresh footprints crisscrossed in the snow, many of them showing recent activity. But no one was visible. The first building he checked was the school where Constance worked. The door stood open, snow drifting into the entrance. Inside, chairs were overturned, papers scattered. Dark stains on the floor that looked like blood, frozen into ice. No bodies. "Constance," he called out. "This is State Trooper Cole. Is anyone here?" Silence. He moved systematically through the village, checking each building. The clinic was ransacked, medical supplies strewn everywhere. The community center's windows were shattered from the inside, glass glittering on the snow. House after house stood empty, doors open, belongings abandoned. At the fifth house, Barnabas found the first body. Elder Zebediah Tuvak lay in his living room, but his death hadn't been peaceful. The 70-year-old man showed defensive wounds on his hands and arms. His face was contorted in fear, eyes wide open. What disturbed Barnabas most were the bite marks on the elder's throat, human bite marks based on the pattern. The room showed signs of struggle. Furniture broken, walls splattered with blood, the window shattered where someone had apparently thrown themselves through it. Zebediah's rifle lay unfired in the corner, as if he'd been unable or unwilling to use it against his attacker. Barnabas photographed everything, his unease growing. Human bites suggested extreme violence, possibly drug-induced psychosis. But what drug could affect an entire village? And where was everyone? A sound from outside made him freeze. Footsteps on the wooden porch. Slow, shuffling, uneven. Barnabas moved to the window, weapon raised, and saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was a woman, middle-aged, wearing only a thin dress despite the killing cold. Her feet were bare, already showing signs of severe frostbite. "Ma'am, I'm State Trooper Cole. Are you hurt?" The woman tilted her head at an unnatural angle, studying him. Her eyes were wrong, pupils dilated so wide the irises were barely visible. Blood covered her mouth and chin, frozen into a grotesque mask. "The old ways failed," she said, her voice flat, emotionless. Zebediah thought his prayers would stop it, but you can't pray away what's already inside. "Ma'am, you need medical attention. Let me help you." She laughed, a sound devoid of sanity. "Help? You want to help? Then leave. Leave before you breathe it too, before it makes you hungry for things you shouldn't want." "Breathe what? What's happening here?" Instead of answering, the woman turned and walked back into the darkness, her frozen feet leaving bloody prints in the snow. Barnabas followed, calling for her to stop, but she disappeared between buildings with surprising speed for someone with severe frostbite. He continued his search, finding 2 more bodies in the next house. A married couple, Robert and Mary Kankington, both showing similar bite wounds and defensive injuries. The house's interior was destroyed, as if a prolonged fight had occurred. Blood patterns suggested multiple attackers. In the back bedroom, Barnabas found something that made his blood run cold. Written on the wall in what looked like blood were the words, "It came in the meat." We ate our sin, the village's food supply. If something had contaminated their food, it could explain mass psychosis. Ergot poisoning, botulism, or other toxins could cause hallucinations and violent behavior. But the human bites, the organized destruction, this seemed deliberate, not random toxic reactions. A child's cry pierced the silence, coming from the direction of the village church. Barnabas ran toward the sound, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly. The church door was barricaded from the outside with boards nailed across it. Someone had trapped people inside. He pulled at the boards with his hands, the cold wood splintering. The crying grew louder, joined by other voices. Moaning, praying, someone reciting scripture in Yupik. When he finally got the door open, his flashlight revealed a scene from a nightmare. 20 or more villagers huddled in the church, but they weren't seeking sanctuary. They were prisoners. Many showed injuries, bite marks, scratches. Children clung to parents who stared with the same dilated pupils he'd seen in the woman outside. In the corner, an old woman rocked back and forth, gnawing on her own arm, blood running down her elbow. "Stay back." A voice from the altar. Josiah Akiak stood there with a hunting rifle, aimed not at Barnabas but at the other villagers. "Don't come closer. They're all infected. All of them. Josiah, I'm Trooper Cole. Lower the weapon. You don't understand." It started 3 days ago, after the supply plane brought the winter meat order. Everyone who ate from it changed, became hungry, not for food, for flesh, for each other. Food poisoning can cause. This isn't food poisoning. Josiah's voice cracked. "My wife, she tried to eat our baby." Literally tried to eat him while he was sleeping. I had to stop her. Lock her up with the others who turned, but it's spreading. Even the ones who didn't eat the meat, they're changing too. Barnabas kept his weapon ready but lowered. "Where's Constance?" She called for help. Dead. Zebediah killed her when she turned. Then the others killed him. It's been getting worse each hour. The hunger, it spreads. Through bites, through blood, maybe through air. I've been keeping the uninfected separated, but there's fewer every hour. A woman in the crowd suddenly lunged forward, moving with inhuman speed despite obvious injuries. She went for a child. Teeth bared, fingers clawed. Josiah's rifle cracked, the woman falling, blood spreading across the church floor. "That was Anna Tuvak," Josiah said, tears streaming down his face. "The school teacher. Yesterday, she was trying to protect the children. Today, she tried to eat one." The implications hit Barnabas like a physical blow. 60 miles from the nearest backup, no communications, surrounded by people exhibiting symptoms of something that might be contagious. He thought about rabies, but the timeline was wrong. Prion diseases, but they took years to develop. This was something else. Something that acted fast and destroyed the mind's basic human inhibitions. "How many are unaffected?" Barnabas asked. "Maybe 10, hiding in their houses. I've been trying to protect them, keep the infected contained. But I'm just one man, and I haven't slept in 2 days." A sound from outside made them both turn. Footsteps, many of them surrounding the church. The infected villagers who'd been roaming had returned, drawn by the gunshot or the voices. Shadows moved past the windows, too many to count. "They hunt in groups now," Josiah whispered. "Pack behavior. They're still human enough to use tools, open doors, but animal enough to feed." The first window shattered, an arm reaching through. Skin shredded by glass but showing no pain reaction. Then another window and another. The infected were coming in and there was nowhere to run. Barnabas made a command decision. "Everyone who can understand me, get behind the altar, now." Some villagers responded, moving slowly. Others remained where they were, lost in whatever madness had taken them. Josiah helped corral the responsive ones while Barnabas watched the windows. They came through simultaneously, 5 or 6 infected villagers, moving with jerky, unnatural gaits. Their faces were masks of hunger, humanity stripped away. One was a child, maybe 8 years old, mouth covered in blood, making sounds that weren't quite human anymore. Barnabas had been in firefights, had killed in the line of duty, but this was different. These were victims, sick people who needed help, not bullets. But when the first one charged, teeth bared, aiming for his throat, training took over. The gunfire was deafening in the church. Bodies fell, but more kept coming. Josiah's rifle added to the chaos. The uninfected screamed, pressed against the back wall. And through it all, Barnabas kept thinking about contamination, about what he might be breathing, about whether he'd ever leave this village alive. The gunfire lasted less than 30 seconds, but it felt like hours. When the smoke cleared, 7 bodies lay on the church floor. Barnabas's hands shook as he reloaded, his mind struggling to process what he'd just done. These weren't criminals or terrorists. They were villagers, people who'd been normal 3 days ago. "We need to get out of here," Josiah said, checking his rifle. "More will come." They're drawn to sound, to blood. Where? Where's safe? "My fish camp, 5 miles upriver. It's isolated, has supplies. We can hold out there until help comes." Barnabas looked at the survivors huddled behind the altar. 6 adults and 4 children, all showing various degrees of shock. Some had the 1,000-yard stare of trauma victims. Others rocked back and forth, muttering prayers. One woman held her infant so tightly the baby was crying. Can they make 5 miles in this cold? They'll have to. Staying here means death. Barnabas tried his satellite phone again. Dead. His radio produced only static. Whatever was happening in Nukarluk, they were cut off from the outside world. They prepared quickly, gathering what supplies they could find. Blankets, a few cans of food that predated the contaminated shipment, ammunition from the dead. Barnabas noticed several survivors eyeing the supplies with an intensity that made him nervous. Were they infected too? Just slower to turn? Or was it normal hunger and fear? The trek to the fish camp was a nightmare of endurance. The temperature had dropped to -40, and several survivors were inadequately dressed, having fled their homes in panic. Barnabas gave his outer parka to an elderly woman, keeping only his base layers and vest. The cold bit immediately, but he'd survive longer than she would without protection. They moved in single file, Josiah leading, Barnabas bringing up the rear, watching for pursuit. The children were carried by adults, their small bodies unable to push through the deep snow. Every few hundred yards they stopped to rest, the group's strength failing in the Arctic cold. At the third stop, Barnabas noticed one of the men, Thomas Kanguk, behaving strangely. He stood apart from the group, staring back toward the village, his head tilted as if listening to something. "Thomas, you all right?" The man turned slowly. His pupils were beginning to dilate. "I can hear them calling. My family. They want me to come back." "Your family is dead, Thomas. What you're hearing isn't real. No, they're alive. Changed, but alive. I can feel them in my head. They're hungry. So hungry. And I'm starting to understand why." Thomas took a step back toward the village. Barnabas raised his weapon slightly, not pointing it directly, but ready. "Don't go back, Thomas. Fight it." "Fight what?" "This isn't a disease, trooper. It's evolution. We're becoming something new. Something that doesn't pretend meat is different when it comes from humans versus animals." The philosophical coherence of the statement chilled Barnabas more than mindless aggression would have. Whatever was affecting these people, it wasn't simply destroying their minds, it was changing their fundamental perception of reality, their basic moral framework. Thomas took another step away. "I'm going back. My wife is waiting. We'll be together in a new way, an honest way. I can't let you go back, Thomas. You'll become dangerous to others. I'm already dangerous, we all are. That's what humanity has always hidden from itself. The veneer of civilization is so thin. one contaminated shipment of meat, and look how quickly it falls away. Josiah acted before Barnabas could decide. His rifle butt caught Thomas in the head, dropping him unconscious into the snow. We tie him up, bring him with us. Maybe it's reversible if we can get medical help. They fashioned a crude sled from branches and blankets, dragging Thomas's unconscious form. It slowed them further, and Barnabas could see hypothermia setting in among the survivors. Lips blue, movement sluggish, the telltale signs of bodies shutting down. The fish camp appeared just as Barnabas thought they'd start losing people to the cold. It was a cluster of small buildings on a rise above the river. A main cabin, storage sheds, and a smokehouse. Isolated, defensible, with sight lines in all directions. They got everyone inside the main cabin, Josiah immediately starting a fire in the wood stove. The warmth was painful as circulation returned to frozen extremities. Several people crying out as feeling came back to fingers and toes. Barnabas secured Thomas in the storage shed, using rope to bind him to the wall. The man was conscious now, but his transformation was accelerating. He didn't struggle against the bonds, just watched Barnabas with those dilated eyes. "You feel it too, don't you?" Thomas said. "The hunger. It starts small, just a thought. What would human taste like? Then it grows. The moral barriers we've built, they're just constructs. The virus, or whatever it is, it strips them away. It's a disease, Thomas. Nothing more. Is it? Or is it showing us what we really are? Every predator species practices cannibalism under the right circumstances. Why should humans be different?" Barnabas left him, disturbed by the clarity of Thomas's madness. Back in the main cabin, he found Josiah taking inventory. The fish camp had enough food for maybe a week, assuming they were careful. But more concerning was what Barnabas observed among the survivors. The elderly woman he'd given his parka to was showing early symptoms. Pupils dilating, increased focus on the others as prey rather than people. A young boy kept licking his lips while staring at his sister. The progression was slower than the initial cases, but it was happening. "It's airborne," Josiah said quietly, having noticed the same things. "Or maybe in the water. We're all infected. It's just a matter of time. There has to be a way to stop it. Medical intervention, antibiotics, something. Look around, trooper. We're 60 miles from the nearest hospital in -40 weather with no communication. Even if help was coming, which it isn't, we'll all have turned before they arrive." Barnabas tried the satellite phone again, desperate. This time, he got a weak signal. He dialed the Bethel station, praying. "Bethel station, this is Daniels. Daniels, this is Cole. I'm in New Carluck. The entire village is compromised. Unknown pathogen causing extreme violent behavior and cannibalistic impulses. Multiple fatalities. Need immediate medical evacuation for survivors." The response was broken by static. "Say again, breaking up, weather system, can't deploy, 48 hours minimum." The signal died completely. 48 hours. They'd all be dead or turned by then. That night, Barnabas stood watch while the others slept fitfully. He could hear Thomas in the storage shed, no longer talking but making sounds that weren't quite human. Growls, whines, and occasionally a laugh that made Barnabas's skin crawl. Around 3 a.m., he heard snowmobiles in the distance. His hope surged. Rescue. But as the sounds grew closer, he realized there were too many. A dozen or more engines coming from the direction of New Carluck. Josiah woke, instantly alert. They're coming, the infected. They can use machines still, at least in the early stages. How do they know we're here? A smell, maybe? Or Thomas is calling to them somehow. Does it matter? They're coming. They woke the others, such as they were. Half showed advanced symptoms now, barely responsive to commands. The children were the worst, the infection seeming to progress faster in smaller bodies. One girl, maybe 6 years old, had to be physically restrained from biting her mother. The snowmobiles stopped just outside rifle range. Barnabas could see figures dismounting, maybe 15 or 20. They moved wrong, sometimes on 2 legs, sometimes dropping to all 4s. In the darkness, lit only by stars and snow reflection, they looked like things from nightmares. "They're surrounding us," Josiah observed. "Hunting tactics. They're still intelligent enough for strategy. What do they want? Us. To feed? To convert? Maybe both. Does it matter?" The first attack came from the side they weren't watching. 3 infected had climbed onto the roof while the main group distracted them. They broke through the ceiling, dropping into the cabin's warmth. One was Constance, the woman who'd called for help originally. Her face was barely recognizable, distorted by whatever changes the infection caused in late stages. The cabin erupted in chaos. Gunfire, screaming, bodies struggling in the confined space. Barnabas shot 2 attackers, but the third, Constance, got past him, falling on one of the elderly men. Her teeth tore into his throat before Josiah could put her down. The main assault came moments later. The infected rushed from all sides, some carrying tools, axes, hammers, anything that could break through walls. They didn't use them as weapons, but as tools to gain entry, their killing done with teeth and hands. Barnabas and Josiah held the doorway, firing into the massive bodies. But for everyone they dropped, 2 more seemed to take their place. And behind him, Barnabas could hear the survivors beginning to turn, the stress accelerating their transformation. The elderly woman he'd tried to save was the first. She turned on a child, her grandmotherly face twisted into something predatory. The mother, who'd been holding her infant too tightly, suddenly bit into the baby's shoulder, the child's scream piercing through the gunfire. "We're losing," Josiah yelled, his rifle clicking empty. Barnabas made a desperate decision. He grabbed a flare from his emergency kit and fired it into the storage shed where Thomas was tied. The old wood, dried by decades of Arctic air, caught immediately. Fire spread quickly, too quickly. "Everyone out! Now!" They fled into the Arctic night, infected and uninfected alike scattering as the fish camp became an inferno. The fire drove back the attackers momentarily, but Barnabas knew it was only buying time. In the chaos, he lost track of who was who. Bodies ran in all directions, some fleeing the fire, others pursuing prey. Josiah was beside him one moment, gone the next. The screams of victims and attackers became indistinguishable. Barnabas ran, following the river, knowing his snowmobile was their only chance of escape. Behind him, the fish camp burned, casting dancing shadows on the snow. He could hear pursuit, footsteps, breathing. That horrible laughing some of the infected did. He reached his snowmobile just as something hit him from behind. He rolled, came up fighting, found himself face to face with Josiah. But Josiah's eyes were fully dilated now, his mouth open, teeth bared. "I held out as long as I could," Josiah said, his voice distorted. "But it's in me now. The hunger. You smell so good, Barnabas. Like warmth, like life." The struggle was brief but vicious. Josiah was stronger than his size suggested, the infection seeming to enhance physical capabilities. But Barnabas had training, desperation, and a knife. When it was over, Josiah lay bleeding in the snow, his last words almost lucid. Tell them not to send help. Burn it all. Don't let it spread." Barnabas started the snowmobile, not looking back as he fled toward Bethel. Behind him, the fire spread to the surrounding forest, an orange glow against the Arctic darkness. He drove for hours, pushing the machine beyond safe speeds, terrified that he was carrying the infection with him, that he'd turn before reaching help. The journey back was a blur of white landscape and growing hunger. Not for food, he had supplies, but for something else. Something his mind shied away from acknowledging. His hands shook on the handlebars, and not from cold. His vision seemed sharper, able to pick out small animals moving in the darkness. The moral voice that said eating human flesh was wrong grew quieter with each mile. Barnabas reached the halfway point to Bethel when his snowmobile sputtered and died. Fuel gauge read empty. He'd been running on reserve for the last 10 miles without realizing it. The silence that followed the engine's death was absolute. He was alone on the frozen Kuskokwim River, 25 miles from help, with the temperature at minus 42 degrees Fahrenheit. He had emergency supplies, but his hands shook so badly he could barely open his pack. Not from cold, from the changes happening inside him. His vision had become unnaturally acute, able to see individual ice crystals in the darkness. His sense of smell was overwhelming. He could detect the scent of a fox that had crossed the river hours ago. The hunger was worse. His emergency rations tasted like cardboard, providing no satisfaction. What he craved was warmth, flesh, the iron taste of... He slammed his fist into the snowmobile's seat, using pain to focus. He had to reach Bethel, warn them, get medical help before he turned completely. 25 miles on foot in Arctic conditions would take 8 to 10 hours if he didn't rest. He'd be hypothermic long before then, but staying here meant certain transformation into whatever the villagers had become. He started walking. The first 5 miles were manageable. His body, changed by the infection, seemed more resistant to cold. His breathing remained steady despite the exertion, but his mind was fragmenting. Memories of the villagers attacking mixed with older memories, his grandmother's funeral, the smell of flowers and formaldehyde. Why did that smell suddenly seem appetizing? At mile 7, he encountered tracks. Human footprints, fresh, maybe an hour old. Someone else was out here. His changed senses picked up a scent trail. Sweat, fear, blood. Someone injured. His mouth watered involuntarily. He followed the tracks off the river into a stand of spruce. There, huddled against a tree, was a young woman. She wore traditional fur clothing and held a satellite phone, trying desperately to get a signal. When she saw Barnabas, relief flooded her face. Thank God. I'm Mary Tungak from Russian Mission. My snow machine broke down. I've been trying to call for help, but... She stopped, noticing his state trooper uniform. Wait, you're police? What happened to you? Barnabas kept his distance, not trusting himself. Don't come closer. There's been an incident in Nukarluk, a contamination. I might be infected. Infected with what? Something that makes people dangerous, violent. You need to get away from me. Mary studied him carefully. Your eyes. The pupils are wrong, like you're on drugs. It's not drugs. It's something that came in contaminated meat. Changes people, makes them attack others, bite them, spread it. Prion disease, like mad cow? Faster. Much faster. Hours or days, not years. And it doesn't just damage the brain, it changes behavior fundamentally. Removes inhibitions against. He couldn't say it. Cannibalism, Mary finished. There are stories. Old stories from the hunger times, when starvation made people do terrible things, but also stories of something else. A sickness that came from eating tainted meat. Made people crave human flesh even when other food was available. You've heard of this before? My grandmother told me. It happened in her village when she was young. 1923. A shipment of reindeer meat from Russia. The whole village went mad. The authorities claimed it was ergot poisoning, but the symptoms were wrong. The survivors were taken away, quarantined, never seen again. Barnabas felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. This has happened before? Several times, according to the stories. Always isolated incidents, always covered up. The government comes, removes all evidence, claims food poisoning or mass hysteria. Then they know, and they're not coming to help, they're coming to contain. Mary stood slowly. We need to get to Bethel, warn people before. Her words were cut off by sounds from the forest. Footsteps, multiple sets, moving fast through the snow. Barnabas smelled them before he saw them, infected from Nukarluk. They'd followed him, tracked him like wolves track prey. Run, he told Mary. Get to your machine. Try to fix it. What about you? I'll delay them. Go. Mary ran, and Barnabas turned to face what was coming. 3 figures emerged from the trees. He recognized them despite their transformation. Villagers from Nukarluk, but changed. Their movements were both human and animal, their faces distorted by whatever the infection did in its final stages. They didn't attack immediately. Instead, they circled him, making sounds that weren't quite speech. One, who might have been the village postmaster, tilted his head and sniffed. You're changing, it said, voice rough, as if the vocal cords were altering. We can smell it. You're becoming like us. I'm fighting it. Why? This is better. Honest. No more pretending we're not predators. No more lies about civilization. They were trying to wait him out, Barnabas realized. Wait for the infection to complete its work, but he still had enough humanity to resist, enough training to act. He drew his service weapon. Back away. All of you. They laughed. That horrible sound infected made, but they recognized the threat. They'd retained enough intelligence to understand guns. You won't shoot us, one said. We're still people. Just changed people. And soon you'll understand. The hunger makes everything clear. Barnabas heard Mary's snow machine roar to life behind him. Good, she'd escaped. Now he just had to. The attack came from above. A 4th infected, hidden in the trees, dropped onto him. Teeth sought his throat, hands clawed at his face. He fired blindly, the sound echoing across the frozen landscape. The attacker fell away, dark blood staining the snow. The others rushed him. Barnabas fired until his magazine was empty, then used the weapon as a club. But there were too many and his strength was failing. Not from exertion, from fighting the infection. His body wanted to join them, to stop resisting. A rifle shot cracked through the air. One attacker fell, another shot, another fall. Mary had. The first 5 miles were manageable. His body, changed by the infection, seemed more resistant to cold. His breathing remained steady despite the exertion. But his mind was fragmenting. Memories of the villagers attacking mixed with older memories. His grandmother's funeral, the smell of flowers and formaldehyde. Why did that smell suddenly seem appetizing? At mile 7, he encountered tracks. Human footprints, fresh, maybe an hour old. Someone else was out here. His changed senses picked up a scent trail. Sweat, fear, blood. Someone injured. His mouth watered involuntarily. He followed the tracks off the river into a stand of spruce. There, huddled against a tree, was a young woman. She wore traditional fur clothing and held a satellite phone, trying desperately to get a signal. When she saw Barnabas, relief flooded her face. Thank God. I'm Mary Tungak from Russian Mission. My snow machine broke down. I've been trying to call for help, but... She stopped, noticing his state trooper uniform. Wait, you're police? What happened to you? Barnabas kept his distance, not trusting himself. Don't come closer. There's been an incident in Nukarluk, a contamination. I might be infected. Infected with what? Something that makes people dangerous, violent. You need to get away from me. Mary studied him carefully. Your eyes. The pupils are wrong. Like you're on drugs. It's not drugs. It's something that came in contaminated meat. Changes people, makes them attack others, bite them, spread it. Prion disease, like mad cow? Faster. Much faster. Hours or days, not years. And it doesn't just damage the brain, it changes behavior fundamentally. Removes inhibitions against... He couldn't say it. Cannibalism, Mary finished. There are stories. Old stories from the hunger times, when starvation made people do terrible things. But also stories of something else. A sickness that came from eating tainted meat. Made people crave human flesh, even when other food was available. You've heard of this before. My grandmother told me. It happened in her village when she was young. 1923, a shipment of reindeer meat from Russia. The whole village went mad. The authorities claimed it was ergot poisoning, but the symptoms were wrong. The survivors were taken away, quarantined, never seen again. Barnabas felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. This has happened before. Several times, according to the stories. Always isolated incidents, always covered up. The government comes, removes all evidence, claims food poisoning or mass hysteria. Then they know. They know, and they're not coming to help, they're coming to contain. Mary stood slowly. We need to get to Bethel. Warn people before... Her words were cut off by sounds from the forest. Footsteps, multiple sets, moving fast through the snow. Barnabas smelled them before he saw them. Infected from Nukarluk. They'd followed him, tracked him like wolves track prey. Run, he told Mary. Get to your machine. Try to fix it. What about you? I'll delay them. Go. Mary ran, and Barnabas turned to face what was coming. 3 figures emerged from the trees. He recognized them despite their transformation. Villagers from Nukarluk, but changed. Their movements were both human and animal, their faces distorted by whatever the infection did in its final stages. They didn't attack immediately. Instead, they circled him, making sounds that weren't quite speech. One, who might have been the village postmaster, tilted his head and sniffed. You're changing, it said, voice rough as if the vocal cords were altering. We can smell it. You're becoming like us. I'm fighting it. Why? This is better. Honest. No more pretending we're not predators. No more lies about civilization. They were trying to wait him out, Barnabas realized. Wait for the infection to complete its work. But he still had enough humanity to resist, enough training to act. He drew his service weapon. Back away. All of you. They laughed, that horrible sound infected made. But they recognized the threat. They'd retained enough intelligence to understand guns. You won't shoot us, one said. We're still people. Just changed people. And soon you'll understand. The hunger makes everything clear. Barnabas heard Mary's snow machine roar to life behind him. Good, she'd escaped. Now, he just had to... The attack came from above. A 4th infected, hidden in the trees, dropped onto him. Teeth sought his throat, hands clawed at his face. He fired blindly, the sound echoing across the frozen landscape. The attacker fell away, dark blood staining the snow. The others rushed him. Barnabas fired until his magazine was empty, then used the weapon as a club. But there were too many, and his strength was failing. Not from exertion, from fighting the infection. His body wanted to join them, to stop resisting. A rifle shot cracked through the air. One attacker fell. Another shot, another fall. Mary had come back, using a hunting rifle from her snowmobile. The remaining infected fled into the forest, their inhuman cries fading into darkness. "Get on," Mary commanded, gesturing to her machine. "I'm infected. I'll turn. I'll attack you." "Not yet, you haven't. And Bethel has a hospital. Maybe they can slow it down." Barnabas climbed on behind her, trying to maintain distance despite the machine's small seat. The 20-mile ride to Bethel was torture. Mary's scent, human, warm, alive, filled his nostrils. The infection whispered suggestions about how easy it would be, how natural, how right. He bit his own hand, using pain to maintain control. Blood ran down his arm, freezing in the wind. Mary noticed, but said nothing, just drove faster. They reached Bethel at dawn. The small town looked normal, peaceful, unaware of the horror spreading from Nukarluk. Mary drove straight to the hospital, half carrying Barnabas inside when his legs gave out. The emergency room erupted in controlled chaos when Barnabas, through gritted teeth, explained the situation. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the head of emergency medicine, immediately ordered isolation protocols. "We need to contact the CDC," she said, examining Barnabas's dilated pupils. "This sounds like a prion disease, but the timeline is impossible." "It's happened before," Mary interrupted. 1923, 1967, 1981. Always in isolated villages. Always covered up. Dr. Hendricks paused. "You're talking about the Ijugig incidents. You know about them?" "Rumors, medical folklore. Supposedly a recurring contamination that causes Wendigo psychosis-like symptoms. But those are just stories. Look at him." Mary pointed at Barnabas, who was now strapped to the bed, fighting against restraints as the hunger grew worse. "Does this look like folklore?" Dr. Hendricks began making calls. Within an hour, the hospital was surrounded by state police, then federal agents. Men in hazmat suits took over Barnabas's care. The CDC arrived, but so did other agencies, ones without clear identification. Barnabas spent the next 3 days in and out of consciousness as they pumped him full of experimental antivirals, antibiotics, and antipsychotics. Nothing stopped the progression, but some combinations slowed it. His lucid moments grew fewer, the hunger stronger. On the 3rd day, during a brief period of clarity, Agent Sarah Coleman, from an unnamed federal agency, interviewed him. "The village has been contained," she said carefully. "All infected have been dealt with. The area is under quarantine." "How many survived?" "That's classified." "You knew this could happen." "Has happened. Why didn't you prevent it?" Coleman was quiet for a moment. "Certain proteins can spontaneously misfold under Arctic conditions. When combined with specific genetic markers common in isolated populations and particular dietary practices, it creates a perfect storm. We monitor, we try to prevent, but we can't predict every instance. Proteins don't make people cannibals." "No, but they can destroy the neural pathways that inhibit certain behaviors. Combined with extreme hunger responses triggered by the misfolded proteins attacking the hypothalamus, it creates a condition that presents as what you experienced." "You're saying it's natural, not some experiment or weapon?" "Nature is capable of horrors we're only beginning to understand. Arctic isolation, genetic bottlenecks, and certain dietary practices create conditions for diseases that shouldn't exist, but do." "What happens to me?" Coleman didn't answer directly. "We're working on treatments. You're already lasting longer than most. Your strong moral framework and training are helping you resist the psychological changes. But Barnabas could feel himself losing the battle. Each day, the hunger grew stronger, the human voices around him sounding more like prey than people. They increased his sedation, but even unconscious, he dreamed of hunting, of feeding, of the honesty of predation. On the 5th day, Mary visited, speaking through an intercom to his isolation room. "They're going to take you to a facility in Atlanta," she said, "for long-term study and treatment." "Study," Barnabas repeated, his voice rough. Like the others from previous outbreaks. Some were cured, they claim, and the rest. Mary was silent. "Don't let them make me a lab rat," Barnabas said. "If I turn completely, if I become one of those things, promise me. The treatment might work. Promise me, Mary." She pressed her hand against the glass. "I promise." The transport to Atlanta never happened. On day 6, while federal agents prepared Barnabas for transfer, news came through secured channels. Another outbreak. This time in Kivalina, a coastal village 300 miles northwest of Nukarluk. Same symptoms, same rapid progression, same contaminated meat from a different supplier. Agent Coleman stood outside Barnabas's isolation room, speaking urgently into her phone. Through the speaker, he heard fragments. Pattern suggests intentional. Multiple suppliers compromised, not natural protein misfolding. When she finished, she turned to him with an expression he'd never seen on her controlled face. Fear. It's spreading. Not person to person, but through the food supply. Someone or something is deliberately contaminating meat shipments to remote villages. "Terrorism?" Barnabas asked, his voice distorted by the advancing infection. His throat had begun to change, the muscles restructuring in ways that made human speech increasingly difficult. He could feel his larynx shifting, adapting for sounds that weren't meant for conversation. "We don't know. The contamination is sophisticated, unlike anything we've seen. It's targeted specifically at isolated communities with limited medical access." "Why?" Coleman hesitated, checking her phone again. More reports were coming in. The affected villages all share certain characteristics. They're all indigenous communities maintaining traditional subsistence lifestyles. Someone might be targeting them specifically. The implications made Barnabas struggle against his restraints, not from hunger, but from rage. "Genocide. You're describing genocide. We can't prove intent yet." But yes, the pattern is disturbing. Over the next 48 hours, 3 more villages reported outbreaks. Point Hope, Shishmaref, Savunga. All coastal communities dependent on marine mammals and caribou for sustenance. The federal response escalated from containment to crisis management. Military units and hazmat gear deployed across Alaska. Supply chains were frozen, all meat shipments quarantined. The governor declared a state of emergency. Barnabas deteriorated rapidly. The drugs that had slowed the infection were losing effectiveness. His periods of lucidity became minutes instead of hours. His body was changing in ways the medical staff couldn't explain. His muscle density increased, his jaw structure altered subtly. His digestive system seemed to be restructuring itself. Blood tests showed impossible things. New enzymes designed to break down proteins that human bodies shouldn't be able to process. During one clear moment, Doctor, Hendricks came to see him personally. She looked exhausted, having been awake for nearly 70 hours straight. "We've identified the pathogen," she said, holding up a tablet showing complex molecular structures. "It's not natural. Someone engineered this. Combined elements of rabies, kuru, and something we can't identify, but that's not the worst part. What could be worse? It's designed to be perfect." not just as a weapon, but as an evolutionary trigger. It doesn't just make people violent or cannibalistic. It's actually trying to change human physiology at a fundamental level, create a new subspecies adapted for predation on other humans. Barnabas processed this through his increasingly fractured consciousness. Someone's trying to evolve us into monsters, or devolve us. Some of the genetic markers it's activating are ancient, pre-human even, dormant sequences in our DNA that haven't been active for millions of years. That night, Barnabas had his last fully lucid period. Mary was there, having refused to leave despite the danger. She'd been researching frantically, calling elders across Alaska, gathering stories that scientists had dismissed as folklore. Through the intercom, she told him what she'd learned. This isn't the first time. My great-aunt in Nome remembers stories from her grandmother. 1887, an entire village on St. Lawrence Island disappeared. The authorities said they starved, but the Siberian traders who found the settlement said there were bite marks on the bones. Human bite marks. How far back do the stories go? As far as oral tradition reaches. The elders say it comes in cycles. Every few generations, something triggers the hunger. Sometimes it's natural, real starvation making people desperate. But sometimes it's this, imposed hunger, manufactured monstrosity. You think someone's been doing this for over a century? Mary pulled out a notebook filled with her research. Not someone, something. The stories are consistent about certain details. The meat always comes from outside. It's always during the dark months, and there are always survivors who are taken away, never seen again. Before Barnabas could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the hospital. Another outbreak, this time in Bethel itself. Someone had contaminated the local food supply, not just meat, but processed foods in the hospital cafeteria. The infection was no longer contained to remote villages. It had reached a population center. The hospital descended into chaos. Within an hour, 17 staff members showed early symptoms. The emergency room filled with bite victims. The National Guard, who had been stationed around the building, began shooting at anyone who approached the perimeter, infected or not. Panic spread faster than the pathogen. In the confusion, someone, Barnabas never learned who, opened his isolation room door. Maybe it was an infected staff member operating on fragmentary intelligence. Maybe it was someone who thought releasing him would add to the chaos. Or maybe, as he sometimes wondered later, it was Mary, giving him a chance to die free rather than as a lab specimen. He should have attacked immediately. The hunger demanded it. Every cell in his transforming body screamed for the iron-rich blood, the specific proteins only found in human flesh. His vision had changed, showing him heat signatures through walls, marking potential prey by their vulnerability. The elderly woman in room 203, weakened by pneumonia. The child in pediatrics, small and defenseless, easy targets. But a fragment of his training, his human self, held on. Instead of hunting, he fled. He stumbled through the hospital's utility corridors, spaces he shouldn't have known, but somehow did. The infection granted strange knowledge, perhaps genetic memories of hiding, stalking, surviving. The streets of Bethel were transforming into a war zone. Infected individuals didn't just roam randomly. They coordinated, using pack tactics that suggested the pathogen carried behavioral programming. They drove vehicles into barricades, used tools to break into buildings, set fires to flush out hidden survivors. This wasn't mindless violence. It was strategic predation. Barnabas made it to the police station, finding it abandoned except for the emergency broadcast system still transmitting automated warnings. Remain indoors. Do not consume any meat products. Military assistance is en route. If you see infected individuals, do not engage. He locked himself in a holding cell, but his transformed hands were stronger than they should have been. The bars bent slightly under his grip. He could escape if he wanted. Part of him, a growing part, wanted to hunt, to feed, to spread the change. Instead, he handcuffed himself to the cell's bench and threw the keys through the bars, out of reach. Whatever he was becoming, he wouldn't let it loose on the town. Hours passed. The hunger grew beyond anything he'd imagined possible. His body was consuming itself, breaking down muscle tissue to fuel the transformation. He could feel his bones lengthening slightly, his spine adjusting, preparing for a different kind of locomotion. The human frame was reshaping itself into something more efficient for pursuit and capture. Outside, Bethel burned. Through the police station's windows, he could see buildings ablaze, military helicopters circling, occasional bursts of gunfire. The infected had overwhelmed the National Guard positions. Some soldiers had turned, adding military training to predatory instinct, a horrifying combination. Then Mary arrived. She shouldn't have been able to reach him. The streets were a killing ground, the police station in a contested zone. But she'd navigated the chaos with help from other survivors, native hunters who knew how to move unseen, how to read the patterns of predator and prey. She stood outside the cell, holding a syringe and a satellite phone. Her clothes were torn, blood, not hers, spattered across her jacket. She'd had to fight to reach him. "I found one of the researchers," she said. "Dr. Yamamoto from the CDC. He was infected, but gave me this before he turned. Said it's experimental, might kill you, might cure you, definitely will stop you from spreading it." "What is it?" "A targeted neurotoxin. It attacks the same neural pathways the pathogen uses, destroys them completely. You'll survive maybe, but brain damage? Severe? Permanent? You won't be the same person." Barnabas looked at his hands. The fingernails had thickened, beginning to curve into claws. Soon, the handcuffs wouldn't hold him. "Do it." "There's something else," Mary said, preparing the syringe. "The satellite phone. I got through to someone. Not government. A group that's been tracking these outbreaks for decades. They want to talk to you." She held the phone to the bars. A woman's voice, elderly, speaking accented English. "Trooper Cole? My name is Dr. Natasha Volkov. I am calling from Novosibirsk. We have been monitoring situation." "Russian?" "Soviet originally, now independent. We have been studying this pathogen since 1919, when it first appeared in Siberia. It is not natural, it is not human-made, it is something else." "What?" "We call it the hunger. It appears throughout history, always in Arctic regions, always during solar minimum periods when cosmic radiation is highest. We believe it is triggered by specific radiation interacting with preserved organic matter in permafrost." "You're saying this is alien?" "No. Terrestrial, but ancient. Older than human civilization. Possibly older than humanity itself. It has been frozen in ice for millennia, released periodically by specific conditions. Someone has learned to harvest it, weaponize it, direct it. Who? We don't know, but pattern suggests they have been conducting experiments for over a century, testing delivery methods, studying effects. Your government knows. They have samples from previous outbreaks, as do we, as do Chinese, Canadians, others. Everyone studies, no one admits. Why tell me? Because you are infected. You have experienced the change from inside. If you survive the treatment, you will remember things others cannot. Genetic memories activated by pathogen. Knowledge of what humanity was before we developed consciousness to suppress our predator nature." Mary pressed the syringe against Barnabas's neck. Now or never. One more thing, Doctor, Volkov said urgently. The contamination in Alaska is not random. Someone is testing large-scale deployment, preparing for global release. The Arctic is just proving ground. The needle went in. The compound burned like liquid fire through his veins. Barnabas felt his nervous system seizing, neurons firing randomly, then dying. His vision fractured into kaleidoscope patterns. His hearing became a roar of static. Every nerve screamed as the medicine and pathogen fought for control of his neural pathways. He was dimly aware of Mary opening the cell, catching him as he convulsed. Others arrived, survivors she'd brought. They carried him through Bethel's burning streets while his body tore itself apart and tried to rebuild. The last clear memory was of a helicopter, military markings, Coleman's face appearing above him. "We've got him," she was saying into a radio. Package secured, en route to containment, then darkness. Not unconsciousness, something deeper. A place where human thought couldn't reach, where only the hunger existed. In that space, Barnabas experienced something ancient. Memories that weren't his own. Images of ice ages, of small bands of proto-humans hunting each other through frozen wastes, of survival so desperate that all taboos fell away. The pathogen wasn't creating something new, it was awakening something old, something humanity had deliberately forgotten. When consciousness returned, he was in a different place, a medical facility but not civilian, underground based on the quality of air and light. His body felt wrong, not infected, but damaged. When he tried to speak, only garbled sounds emerged. The language centers of his brain were gone, destroyed by the treatment. Coleman was there, older looking, exhausted. She held up fingers. 3 months had passed. Through painstaking rehabilitation, Barnabas learned to communicate again. Not speech, that was gone forever, but writing, slowly, laboriously. His motor control was severely compromised. His left side was partially paralyzed. His cognitive function was impaired but not destroyed. The news was grim. Bethel had been saved, barely. The military had implemented extreme containment protocols. Anyone showing symptoms was eliminated. The official death toll was 347. The real number was likely higher. Other villages hadn't been as fortunate. Kivalina was gone, the entire population either dead or missing. Shishmarev had been firebombed when containment failed. The government was calling it a series of tragic accidents, unrelated incidents of food poisoning and civil unrest. But the real war was happening in secret. Coleman showed him classified reports. Similar outbreaks in Siberia, suppressed by Russian forces. Northern Canada experiencing unusual wildlife disease that affected humans. Scandinavia reporting mass psychosis events in Sami communities. "It's global," she wrote on a pad, speaking slowly so he could read her lips. "Someone is testing delivery methods worldwide, preparing for something bigger." Barnabas wrote one word: who? "We've traced shell companies, followed money, analyzed distribution patterns. Everything leads to dead ends. Whoever they are, they've been planning this for generations, maybe longer." Mary visited when they allowed it. She'd become something of an expert, consulting with epidemiologists, sharing traditional knowledge that proved surprisingly accurate. She told him about the resistance movements in the villages, people who refused to eat processed food, who returned to traditional preservation methods, who trusted elder knowledge over government assurances. "The old ways protect us," she said. "Smoking meat properly, aging it correctly, the rituals we perform, they're not just tradition. They're survival techniques encoded in culture." Barnabas wanted to respond. to share what he'd learned in that dark space between human and monster. But the words wouldn't come. The knowledge was there, terrible truths about human nature, about what we were capable of becoming, but his damaged brain couldn't translate them into language. Instead, he drew maps of infection patterns, diagrams of distribution networks. Slowly, painfully, he compiled intelligence from his fragmented memories. The infection had given him insights into the perpetrators' methods, their goals, their timeline. Coleman studied his drawings with growing alarm. "You're showing systematic preparation for a massive release. These aren't random tests, they're building towards something." Barnabas managed to write, "Summer solstice, maximum population movement, tourist season, 6 months from now." He nodded, then drew more. Shipping routes, processing plants, distribution centers. The infrastructure for a global contamination event was already in place. All it needed was activation. "We'll stop it," Coleman said, but her voice lacked conviction. The truth was, they were fighting an enemy they couldn't identify, using resources they couldn't acknowledge, protecting a population that didn't know it was under threat. And every agency involved was keeping secrets, studying the pathogen for their own purposes, seeing opportunity in the horror. Barnabas was transferred to a long-term care facility in Anchorage, officially a veterans hospital, but actually a containment center for those who'd survived infection. There were 17 others, all showing varying degrees of neural damage, all carrying antibodies that might be crucial for developing vaccines. They were studied, tested, their blood drawn daily. Lab rats who'd once been people, but they were also witnesses, carrying memories of transformation that science couldn't fully explain. In group therapy, a dark joke, since most couldn't speak, they communicated through drawings, gestures, shared understanding. They'd all experienced the hunger, the clarity of purpose that came with abandoning human morality. Some missed it. The simplicity of predation, the absence of guilt or shame. Others, like Barnabas, were haunted by how easy it had been to slip into monstrosity, how thin the line was between human and beast. Dr. Volkov visited once, using diplomatic immunity to bypass American security. She was ancient, 90 if she was a day, but her eyes were sharp. "You understand now," she said, speaking Russian that somehow Barnabas comprehended despite his language damage. "The hunger is always there, waiting. Every human carries it. The pathogen just removes inhibitions." He wrote, "Why Arctic? Cold preserves. Ice remembers. Permafrost is Earth's memory, storing everything that ever died here, including things that should stay dead. The source?" She smiled grimly. "There are places in Siberia, in Alaska, in Greenland, where ice is millions of years old, where things froze before humans evolved. Someone found something there, and learned to wake it up." Before leaving, she gave him a gift, a carved piece of walrus ivory, ancient-looking, covered in symbols, from people who survived outbreak in 1743. They developed immunity through ritual cannibalism, controlled doses of infected flesh, processed specially. Horrible, but effective. The knowledge is preserved in these carvings, if one knows how to read them. Barnabas studied the ivory, recognizing patterns from his infection dreams. Instructions for survival written in symbolic language, passed down by people who'd faced the hunger and found ways to coexist with it. Years passed. Barnabas learned to function despite his limitations. He worked with Coleman's task force, providing intelligence, analyzing patterns. They prevented 17 contamination attempts, each more sophisticated than the last. But they never found the source, never identified the perpetrators. Mary became a leader in the indigenous health movement. teaching communities to recognize contamination signs, to trust traditional knowledge, to maintain food sovereignty. She visited Barnabas regularly, bringing news from the villages, stories of resistance and resilience. They're adapting, she told him, creating their own food networks, independent of government supply chains. They remember what happened, even if officially it never did. The predicted summer attack never came, or rather, it was attempted, but failed, stopped by village elders who recognized the signs and destroyed contaminated shipments before they could be distributed. Traditional knowledge had succeeded where modern surveillance had failed, but the threat remained. In his dreams, Barnabas still felt the hunger. Sometimes he woke with the taste of iron in his mouth, phantom memories of feeding. His body remembered what his mind tried to forget. 5 years after New Karluk, Coleman retired, replaced by younger agents who saw the Arctic outbreaks as historical curiosities rather than ongoing threats. Funding for monitoring decreased. Attention shifted to other dangers, but Barnabas kept watching. From his small apartment in Anchorage, he monitored news from across the Arctic. Unusual wildlife die-offs that might indicate contamination. Missing person reports that fit the pattern. Supply chain anomalies that suggested preparation. He corresponded with other survivors, comparing notes, sharing intelligence. They called themselves the Remembered, those who'd been infected and lived to carry the knowledge. They were broken but not defeated, damaged but not destroyed. On quiet nights, Barnabas could feel it, the hunger, waiting in the permafrost, in the ancient ice, in the dark corners of human genetic memory. It would return. It always did. The only questions were when and whether humanity would remember how to resist. His final report, submitted to Coleman's successor but never officially acknowledged, concluded with a warning. The pathogen is not the true threat. It is merely a key, unlocking something already present in human nature. The real enemy is whoever holds that key and their vision for humanity's future. They see us as livestock that has forgotten its place in the food chain. They intend to remind us. The Arctic communities have developed cultural immunity through generations of exposure and survival. Their traditional knowledge is our best defense. But modern civilization, removed from these hard truths, remains vulnerable. The hunger is patient. It has waited millions of years. It can wait longer. And somewhere, someone is preparing to wake it again, not as a test, but as a transformation. When they do, we must be ready. Remember New Karluk. Remember the price of forgetting what we are capable of becoming. And never trust meat you didn't kill yourself. Some will read this as the ravings of a brain-damaged survivor. But those who've felt the hunger know the truth. We are all one contaminated meal away from monstrosity. The only difference between predator and prey is circumstance. Alaska remembers. The permafrost remembers. And we, who survived, remember. That memory is the only thing standing between humanity and the hunger that waits in the ice. The report was classified, filed, forgotten. But in villages across Alaska, elders told stories of the winter the hunger came. Children learned to recognize the signs. Communities prepared. Because in the Arctic, survival had always depended on remembering that nature was not humanity's friend, that civilization was a temporary arrangement, and that the hunger, ancient, patient, eternal, was always waiting for its moment to return.